And the woods where you once stood, the evening lights are always bright, and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways, and the woods where you once stood, the evening lights are always bright, and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling.
My name is Tom Sullivan, Chairman of Cavan Genealogy. You're all very welcome this morning to the start of our two-day event in relation to migration. It's called In Anxious Expectation, searching for that elusive ancestor. The programme today, we have a list of distinguished speakers speaking about the subject. Later on that in the evening time, we'll have music in the town hall with the Dr. Galligan Cultus group based in Kilnalek and their friends. Tomorrow then we have, in the morning we have a workshop in relation to ancestral tracing, which will give everyone an opportunity to see the various genealogical sources and the origin and development of surnames and such like. Then we have Dr. William Rulston talking about a subject that is very close to the Cavan people, farming and researching our farming ancestry. And then later on in the afternoon there will be a tour of West Cavan conducted by Dr. Brendan Scott. Now, this event is part of the Cavan Calling Programme, and the Cavan Calling Programme is a very exciting development that will take place for the next 5 days. It's a homecoming festival, welcoming Cavan people of Cavan ancestry home from abroad, and also, of course, for Cavan natives and the new communities to Cavan, and people who are not from Cavan at all, but are also resident in Ireland. So everyone's welcome to it. There's a very exciting programme of culture, music, various heritage events, sport, culinary delights, business, all encompassing, but I'm sure the Chief Executive will be talking about that later on. It's very appropriate, though, that this programme in relation to, or this event in relation to ancestry and ancestry tracing kicks off the Homecoming Festival, because if people didn't go abroad and there was no such thing as emigration, there'd be no need for a Homecoming Festival. So this starts the programme. Now the programme and the celebration was the idea of our Chief Executive, Tommy Ryan, and the person who implemented the programme is the County Librarian, Emma Clancy. So we thank them for their initiative and work, and we're delighted that Tommy has come here this morning to address you with the opening remarks for the opening of this event. Tommy.
Thank you, Tom, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm delighted to be here at the opening event of Cavan Calling, and to see such a good crowd present here for the first event. And as Tom said, Cavan Calling is a festival for Cavan people, but it's for any friends of Cavan. We developed a diaspora strategy about 4 years ago now, maybe 5 years ago, and we looked at who are the Cavan diaspora. And of course they are people who have Cavan heritage, but there are friends of Cavan, there are friends of people who are from Cavan, they do business with people who are from Cavan, or they just have a curiosity about Cavan, and they're all part of the Cavan diaspora. So I'm delighted to be here today, and delighted that our Cahill Philip Brady, who will be moving from event to event over the next 5 days, to have him here. And also want to thank Emma for her organisation of the whole Cavan Calling Festival, and I'll thank a few people at the end in relation to the organisation of this seminar or conference on migration and ancestry. So this weekend gives us all a chance to celebrate all that is good about Cavan, and we're going to welcome our members and our members of our heritage and ancestry from across the world, and also the new Irish or the new Cavan people from Eastern Europe and from Africa. Many of them have made their homes here in Cavan, and they're part of a diaspora themselves, but they're also part of Cavan. So Tom did mention the programme. There is an extensive programme, there is a website, and if you get a chance you can dip in and out of the various activities and events that will be taking place over the next 5 days. There's a Cavan Family Day in the town, I suppose, in Killikeen Forest Park in the County Museum. So it's taking place in many places. There's a food market, craft market, there's drama, there's music events, and I know Tom mentioned one of the music events tonight. There's a book launch, book launches actually, and one number of book launches, and I just see the GA have a book, we're launching a book, and there's 3 or 4 books being launched during the event. There's a business event in the digital hub, and then of course Saturday is the really busy day with the book culminating in the Boomtown Rats and a fireworks display, and I suppose we can just hope that it'll be fine, but if it's not, we still can go out and party. So if you need your raincoat, bring it with you. And we're also linking with our partners in the GA in relation to Breffni Park. It's 100 years old. I know George has launching a book tonight, tomorrow night. I'm so mixed up in all the dates. Tonight, I can't be there, but it's tonight. Yes, tonight. Tomorrow night. Yeah, and I can't be there for that. Sorry, George. But so it's great to be linking with Breffni Park in relation to 100 years in Breffni Park. So I'd like to thank the GA for that. But as Tom said, it is appropriate that we start Cavan Calling with a 2-day event on migration and genealogy, because so many Cavan people immigrated. And the numbers are astonishing. It's estimated that for the period 1815 to 1921, upwards of 210,000 people left Cavan. That's nearly 3 times the current population. So when you put that into perspective, like, it just shows you how immigration devastated rural Ireland in that period. And I suppose the United States, from the late 1830s, the United States became the major destination for all those immigrants, and in particular the northeastern states. And I have been fortunate to visit the United States, and have met many Cavan people on my visit there. And some of them are more recent immigrants, maybe in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s. But last year, I was with the Cathaoirleach John Paul Feely, and we visited Toronto, Cavan Monaghan Township in Ontario. And in the Cavan Monaghan Township, the people from Cavan that immigrated there did it pre-famine. And there's towns in Cavan Monaghan called Cavan, Baileyborough, and a number of other towns that are named after Cavan here. And I don't know how many generations they have been over there, but they still have a link here with Cavan. And we also visited Rochester in New York State, and did a friendship or a twinning with Monroe County, and there's visitors here from Rochester coming for Cavan Calling, and that link came about because of the legacy of Colonel Patrick Henry O'Rourke, and who was an American Civil War hero. So we're delighted that the Rochester Fringe Festival will be performing here on Saturday. I think it's outside the library here. Hopefully it's fine, but it is a comedy duo, and it'll be part of all the activities that are going on Saturday. Colonel Patrick O'Rourke features in Jonathan Smith's book. It's one of the books that was launched. It's commissioned by our own library service, and Jonathan Smith works here in the library, and some of you may be familiar with Jonathan. He does articles in the Anglo-Celt on a historical Cavan person. So we've compiled that into a book, and that will be launched here on Friday at 6 o'clock. Yeah. So I suppose the lectures in the conference are wide-ranging and give a broad insight into the subject of migration. And the list of speakers have great experience and knowledge, and I've met some of them before. The Mellon Centre for Migration Studies in Omagh, County Tyrone, has been a friend and partner of Cavan genealogy for many years, and Dr. Patrick Fitzgerald is joining us from Omagh to talk about migration. Monsignor Liam Kelly, who's well known to you all, will set the scene with his talk on life in County Cavan before 1700. He must have a long memory. And I'm saying life was much more difficult than it is now. Dr. Brendan Scott, lecturer on West Cavan and the Kingdom of the McGoverns, and whet your appetites for the historical tour. That's tomorrow, which will explore the beautiful and rich and diverse physical and cultural landscape of West Cavan. And I do think it's nearly, I'm Roscommon, so I nearly think it's like the west of Ireland, more than Cavan. I just throw that in. So other topics include farming, immigration, the influence and spread of Gaelic games abroad, which had a big influence on the diaspora, and opportunities for them to meet and engage in social and cultural and sporting activities. And letters from America. They're a very important link with loved ones. Nowadays, there's a WhatsApp. If your child goes down the town, you're WhatsApping them to see, did they get there? Back in the day, they went to America, and nobody knew for 4 months if they got there. So the letters are really important. And music, of course, along with the sport, the music was something that the immigrants brought with them, and it was a feature of their life. And Cavan man Ed Reevy is an example of this. He left Coot Hill for Philadelphia at age 15 in 1912 and became a world-renowned fiddle player. So I also welcome Dr. Galligan, Keolta's Kinelec branch. They're coming to the town hall this evening for a concert, so that should be a very good evening. Laura O'Moroku has worked for decades to promote and develop the Irish cultural traditions throughout Ireland and beyond, and he will speak during the concert about the global organisation that is Keolta's Comhaltas Éireann and its worldwide branch network. Arthur Sullivan will speak about the global GA later this afternoon, and it will be evident that both Keolta's Comhaltas Éireann and the GA act as incredible links and relationship builders in communities and across the world, throughout the world, and help the diaspora to meet and socialise and build connections. So the genealogy workshop tomorrow will allow you to learn more about the various sources used in genealogy research. And it is I try to do a bit of my own family history. It's very, if you start, it's very time consuming, and you can go in wrong directions. It's easy to go down a completely wrong direction, and probably more so you in this room know more about that than I do. But I suppose learning about the sources and how to use them, I think, is really important. And it'll also include information about place names, their origin, the development of the Irish surnames as well, and the land of the state. So there's an awful lot in place names and surnames. Dr. William Ralston will wrap up tomorrow with his talk on researching our farming ancestors before you depart on your bus tour. So just a bit about the Cavan Genealogy Company. It's in existence since 1988, and the Council is delighted to provide ongoing support to it. Now, as well as providing genealogical information, the centre also provides valuable tourist information. So, I mean, genealogy and tourism are linked, inextricably linked. So, this conference will give you an opportunity to connect and to reconnect, to relive the past, and to enjoy the music, the song and dance. I suppose when you look at the numbers of people that immigrated from Cavan, it was a significant aspect of Cavan's past and every part of the county experience. And I just see Madeline down here, and one of our oldest, one of our oldest diaspora is St. Killian, who left Mulla in, that's recorded, I'm sure people left that time as well, but St. Killian left Mulla in 685 or 1400 years ago. So, as recorded members of the diaspora, I'd say he's one of the oldest members of that. So, and that has developed a link as well with Germany, and a very rich link that happens because of that. So I suppose this event sets the ideals for Cavan Calling Festival, and I hope you enjoy it. And I wish, if you're visiting, I wish you a very happy visit. And just want to finish off by thanking Tom, and Tom is chair of the Genealogy Company, Mary, and Concepta, and all the staff of the Genealogy Company for organising the event and arranging the speakers and making all the arrangements. And I want to thank Emma as well for overall organising the Cavan Calling. And I suppose without all of the work these people do, none of us would be here today. So it's great to see such a crowd, and I know it's live streamed as well. So hopefully you have a great few days. You'll learn something about Cavan, and you'll learn something about your how to research your own genealogy or help somebody to research theirs. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chief Executive Tommy, and also thanks Philip, our Cohera, for coming here this morning. I know it's a very busy year for him, but we appreciate you coming here today. Just a few housekeeping events before we start our first lecture. The emergency exits just there, right at the corner here. Restrooms here behind me as well, gents first and ladies behind that. So our first speaker this morning is Dr. Paddy Fitzgerald from Omagh. As the Chief Executive said, Paddy has been a good friend of the library here before. He's going to talk about the iconic letter from America. But Paddy is currently the Head of Research and Development at the Mellon Centre for Migration Studies in Omagh, and was formerly Curator of Emigration History at the Ulster American Folk Park. He also taught at Queen's University MSSC in Irish Migration Studies. He has lectured widely on the subject of emigration both in Ireland and abroad, and is a great friend of the service here, having lectured here previously and been involved in a number of cross-border projects with us. He is extensively published in journals and books, including Editing with Anthony Russell, John Mitchell, Ulster and the Great Irish Famine, published in 2017, and as an essay, The 17th Century Irish Connection, in Tom Devine and Jennifer Wormel's The Oxford Handbook of Modern Scottish History. However, his most important work is his writing with Dr. Brian Lampkin, Migration in Irish History, 1607 to 2007, published in 2008. It is the definitive work on the subject, gives a comprehensive overview of the period, and for anyone studying the topic, it is the perfect work. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Paddy Fitzgerald.
I'm a little shorter than Tommy. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real, genuine pleasure to be back in the Johnston Library in Farnham Street in Cavan Town after a little bit of what we might call a pandemical pause. As we come together to respond to Cavan Calling, and profound and sincere thanks at the beginning to everybody who behind the scenes has been involved. Tommy mentioned the names. organising this brilliant event, 5-day event, and the 2-day conference, because without that work behind the scenes, it doesn't happen. It scares me to admit that some 30 years ago I was busy scanning the portfolio of Irish art, dealing with the theme of emigration, when I first cast my eyes upon this particular image. Then, as now, one senses the invitation to take up one's creepy stool in the cabin and listen in on the contents of the letter which has wended its way east across the Atlantic. This cabin was almost certainly located in West Cork, where the artist James Brennan did most of his work in oils. But it could have been anywhere in rural Ireland. The 5 inhabitants process the news from America, the formal title Brennan gave the picture. The beauty of art as historical evidence is that it remains open to the interpretation of the viewer. All of you can read it with your own eyes. And it is interesting to reflect that artists very rarely ever record or write down the particular motivation that they have in the strokes they make on the canvas. So it is open, as I say, to our interpretation. If you were stood in front of the large canvas in the Crawford Municipal Art Gallery in Cork, you might turn to a friend and compare notes, open a conversation about who the 5 subjects are and what they might be thinking. I have to say I owe a debt of gratitude to Mary Sullivan for informing my take on the scenario. The central figure in the picture is the reader of the letter, a young 10, 11-year-old barefoot girl, poring over the news of an older brother or sister in America. Her literacy, the fruits of national schools set up from 1831 on. Her face lit up by natural light from the doorway, perhaps a visual metaphor for a brighter tomorrow in the new world. Listening intently with his ear cocked, the father, or might you say a grandfather, holds in his left hand an enclosure, quite possibly a prepaid ticket for New York, Boston, or Philadelphia. An older sister, dressed as if ready to go, appears eager but pensive, perhaps imagining her arrival at Castle Garden in New York. The mother, or grandmother, leans on the table, resigned to the departure of another of her children, or grandchildren. Slightly apart by the hearth, but still listening in, sits a pipe smoker, whose own future may be impacted by the reverberations of the recently arrived missive. Might he be intended to hint at one more confident in his native tongue? Details catch the eye of the viewer. The hen, going back forward, there's me laser. The hen pecking on the rough dirt floor, a classic marker of small farm life as recorded by so many artists. The barefoot child may be a pointer at shoes not worn but saved in summer. A pot of potatoes ready for consumption, but a hint, surely, of the memory of the devastating trauma of the Great Famine a generation before. Panes of glass in the window may be paid for by remittances sent from children overseas. An ill-fitting door frame ensuring a draught which drew the family around the turf fire. A top hat, maybe once worn by a gentleman on Stephen's Green, kept on despite the hearth. A quick word on the artist James Brennan. Brennan was born in Dublin in 1837 and spent his childhood against the backdrop of the famine, and perhaps tellingly left for England as a young teenager, returning to Ireland in 1855. In 1860 he was appointed as the headmaster of the Cork School of Art and later transferred to a similar institution in Dublin, where he was elected as a member of the Royal Irish Academy in 1889 and dies in Rathmines in 1907 at the age of 70. He was well familiar with the interior of small farmhouses and committed his energies to promoting the Irish lace industry. 8 years prior to News from America, he had produced another departure scene as the young woman has her name added to the trunk she will soon take as luggage to the New World. The tableau vivant, by which a scene of a painting can be reconstructed, could be a powerful learning tool and popular with gallery educators. Some years ago, we used the Mellon House in the Folk Park to do just this with News from America, asking 5 public history students from Queen's to step into the shoes of the Brennan's family and then share their thought bubbles. Today, as we are increasingly encouraged to other the often desperate migrant, it is all the more important to be able to empathise with the experience of our own migrant ancestors and see the links and connections to today. I feel sure that we shall have a very rich 2 days, and thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Paddy. We won't take any questions on the iconic letter because we want to try and keep the schedule. At this stage, I want to thank Adrian Donoghue for his work in relation to photographs, and also, before I forget, the library staff who have facilitated the work here. Emma, of course, Pauline, Jonathan, Martin and Catherine. Catherine came in very early this morning to help out, so we appreciate all that. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Monsignor Liam Kelly. Monsignor Liam is going to talk about the background Cavan before 1700. Now, Liam Kelly is a priest of the Diocese of Kilmore and a noted historian. He's widely published and is a former editor of Breffni. In fact, he was chairman of Breffni as well. Breffni is the journal of Common-Shanachus Breffni. He was chairman of Common-Shanachus Breffni, I think on a number of occasions. His first book, The First Vitality of the Land War, Philip Meehan, 1845 to 1800 to 1900 was the dates wrong there, was recently published by Common-Shanachus Breffni. His lecture at this year's Common-Shanachus AGM, The Boxer and the Chalice, American Links to Local History, was one of the most enjoyable I've heard in quite a while. Other published works by Monsignor Liam include A Flame Now Quenched, Rebels and Frenchmen in Leitrim, 1793 to 1798. Also, Photographs and Photography in Irish Local History, published 2008. With Dr. Brendan Scott, who is also on today's programme, he co-edited Leitrim History and Society, published in 2019. His major work, however, is The Diocese of Kilmore, circa 1100 to 1800, published 2017. It's a scholarly and accessible study of the Diocese of Kilmore and the counties of Cavan and Leitrim, and is an invaluable reference book for any scholar studying this history. Monsignor Liam.
Is somebody better at this than I am, maybe? Thanks, Mary, for that, and thanks to Hom for the introduction as well. I don't think I've ever had such a broad topic to talk on before as Cavan before 1700. And I think the whole idea behind it is just to give sort of a background about the territory that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of days, but also to give an idea how that place has changed over a period of time. So I'm going to go back, I suppose, to when County Cavan was known as Breffni, or more precisely East Breffni, and the change as it becomes County Cavan over a period of time. So we really have to let go of a lot of our understanding of what the place was like, because things were very different. People looked different, houses looked different. The landscape, I suppose, the basics were still the same, of mountains and rivers and lakes, but not much else was the same. So we need to let go of some of our modern thinking and try and immerse ourselves for a short while in what life might have been like back 500 years ago, and how that changed over a period of time. Just to say, maps can be a useful way of trying to understand how outsiders saw Cavan or Breffni, and this is one map, Abraham Ortelius in 1572, and you can see it's Ireland here on its back, really, and from a perspective, from the English viewpoint, or from the viewpoint of the Pale. And it says a lot, because there's great detail about the east coast, about East Ulster, all of Leinster and Munster. But there's virtually no information about Connacht or Breffni or all of the northwest of Ireland. And in many ways, it was terra incognito. It was unknown territory. The only information that they have about County Cavan or about Breffni on this map is they have mentioned Cavan, the town of Cavan. They mention Brenny, an abbreviation of Breffni, and they mention O'Reilly's. Those are the only three things about it. So they hadn't really a clue what was going on here. So it was really a different world. And Breffni was, as they say, a place where the King's writ didn't run. It was beyond the Pale. It was the place where the wild Irish lived. And some would say nothing has changed, but it certainly was regarded as uncivilized, as being beyond the Pale and very different to what life was like in the Pale or in England or in most parts of Europe. So that was the perspective that we get at that time. So we're going to take a brief look. There'll be a good few images, and inevitably I'm going to be just dealing very briefly with different aspects of it, but just it might give us some idea of what to look at. So a brief glimpse. First of all, the landscape we talked about, mountains and rivers, lakes basically the same, but there certainly was more foliage around, more trees, more bushes, more of that wildness there. It wasn't all into fields and fenced and that type of thing, a very different sort of thing. So of course the woods gave protection to animals, but also to people who were hiding in times of war and stuff like that. Mountains, lakes, still the same. I think the big one is no roads or bridges. I mean, there are virtually, most people cross rivers with stones, where there were stone pavements across. There were various towns or various places at rivers where you could cross, but a lot of them, very few bridges, and if there were, they were wooden and temporary, and no roads at all. I mean, when William Bedell came to Cavan, and in I think it was 1629 he came, and he talked about not a single road in the parish of Kilmore, which is just outside the town here. So there was, I just put down the word boher here because the Irish word boher comes from the Irish for a cow, bow, and it means a cow track. And I suppose it gives an understanding of how roads developed, that there were these cow tracks or passes through the woods and through the landscape that people used, but who inevitably were wet and boggy, and so a very different world. Population much smaller. We have no accurate figures for what life might have been, or many might have been around, but much smaller population than now. And also they lived in pockets. We'll look at that in a moment. They weren't evenly spread over a whole area as well. Language, basically, in nearly all of Breffni at this time was Irish. It was part of Gaelic Ireland, and the Gaelic way of life was prominent there. And there were people probably in Cavan Town who had some English because of trading with Pale and trading with different places. Families like the McBrady's or McBrady's, who are commercial people here in Cavan. But generally, everybody spoke Irish, or virtually everybody. And also, and I suppose it needs to be said, that virtually everybody were Roman Catholic pre-Reformation. So it was a different sort of world. The families were largely tribal. A lot of the families lived in groups together. It wasn't single families like you have now, living in a house and no relations near them maybe. That time, they very often grouped together for security, and they depended on one another. So you had this sense of togetherness from families and stuff like that. But I suppose one thing we have to say as well is that because the King's Writ didn't run there in Breffni, it was very often a violent place. There were outbreaks of local wars and cattle raids and all sorts of things breaking out, and which left an unstable society at times, and at times a violent one that we would regard as very violent from our modern perspective. Just briefly to give an idea of the houses, most of the houses at this period were poor quality, very often circular houses made of wattles and plastered with mud and thatched. Now, I say I'm not an expert on it, but it'll give you an idea, because very few houses from this period have survived. And this is part of the reason, that the houses are very often temporary, and they could be attacked easily, they could be burned easily, and very often people were more mobile as well, that they moved around, depending on the time of year, maybe for grazing, or if there was a local war on or whatever. So houses were not substantial buildings like we'd understand now. There were more substantial buildings around, and one of them was the ring forts, and there was a lot of them around Cavan. A lot of the Drumlin Hills had these ring forts on them, not as substantial as maybe this one here or whatever, but those various types of ring forts where families and sometimes groups of families lived within the security of these circular enclosures. And sometimes there was more than one circular enclosure, and sometimes you had these outfields as well here for grazing animals and for keeping them safe at night and that type of thing. I should say as well that back then that there were, the woods and smaller population meant that there were more variety of wild animals around. Things like wolves, for instance, or wild boars or whatever. So we had, again, have to change our understanding of the time. Something that was very popular, and again, like the ring fort, the better off people, sometimes it was a status symbol to have your own ring fort or your own cronach. And they were lake dwellings built where piles driven down out in the lake, and families lived there for security and stuff like that. And not every lake, but a lot of the lakes in Cavan have survived examples of where there were cronachs. So again, an unusual place in our understanding to live. But it did give some security, but once gunpowder came, they were less secure than before. Some of the buildings were very substantial buildings, and I suppose the most substantial one of all was Clogher Castle. I don't want to go into any detail on it, but it's really of the Norman skill of building with stone and built in a circular way and with huge walls, that it was a very substantial one. There were other substantial buildings as well, but I say the castles maybe that some of the O'Reillys had or some of the other local chieftains had, they were stoned, and they were more substantial than the houses that we talked about earlier. But it was only, I say, they were the exception rather than the rule in many ways. One of the substantial buildings right around the Breffni were the parish churches. There was a network of parish churches a church in every parish in the Breffni, and they were small by our modern understanding. They were rectangular buildings, usually just rectangular, not able to maybe hold a maximum 100 people maybe, but they were built with solid stone, and quite a few surviving ruins have survived on these. This is a map here of the diocese of Kilmore. I don't know how much you can see of it or not, but it shows where the pre-Reformation churches, and they're pretty well scattered right around the Breffni. So they were substantial buildings, but also there was a network around them that we as well, and it's something that we maybe hasn't got enough attention in understanding the Reformation period and the impact of it, because each parish church had land, Charman land, which provided sanctuary for travellers, for the people who are sick, for pilgrims and that type of thing. So that there was a system of pastoral care in each parish that disappeared after the Reformation. So not only was there a parish church, there was a resident priest who sometimes lived in the building or beside the church building, but also there was a Neranuk, a lay church person who looked after the church property and who provided hospitality in what were known as a Choc A, house of hospitality. So there was these little houses in virtually every parish had them, where they provided shelter and cared, rudimentary care for sick, but also gave rest and food for the traveller. That whole system collapsed by about the year 1610 or so. Also just around here, and I've circled this area here, this here is La Uchter. You can see that lake there, and the only 3 monasteries in Breffni were all within a short distance of La Uchter. Drumlane Priory, which you're going to see tomorrow, the Holy Trinity Abbey here on Holy Trinity Island, and the Franciscan Friary here in Cavan Town. They were the only 3. There were much fewer monasteries in this part of Ireland than there were in the south and the west, where they had a lot of monasteries, but most of them set up in the 12th, 13th centuries. So here, the 3 were here within a short distance of each other. And in many ways, it gives a clue that this here is the centre and focus of Breffni. And also that because there were no roads, the waterways, La Uchter was the motorway. That was the main thoroughfare that people travelled by. It was easier to travel by water, a small boat and canoe, and link up with the Erne and with other areas as well. So water travel, and there were in many ways river people or water people, and that was an important aspect of it at a time when there were no roads. So this here in many ways, and of course Cavan Town is within this circuit, that this was the hub, if you like, certainly of East Breffni, and all 3 monasteries in the diocese were within a few miles of that. We're going to look briefly at the map of East Breffni and some of the families that resided here. Now, let's say it's only just some of them, and they're not necessarily placed where they should be within Breffni, because it was hard to place them all where they're supposed to go in. So, but I've included some of them. I put O'Reilly's in red there because they were the dominant tribe or family for virtually all of the period that we're talking about. And they had a number of castles right different parts around Breffni as well, not just here in Cavan Town. We'll look at one of them in a moment. But there's so many other families. I know you're going to West Cavan tomorrow, and the main family down there was McGauran or McGauran, and they were the dominant family and still the most prominent name in West Cavan. Their scribes or poets were the MacPartlins, who are quite famous learned family who wrote poetry and Pros, and so but so many other families. The O'Donoghues, McKiernan here in Tullyhunshaw or the Killishandra area, and different families here. I say right around McBrothy's, I suppose, one of the most common ones. McGowan's, McGivney's, McGargan. They're Gargan, an unusual name. And some of these were clerical families, providing priests and clergy for the parishes, but also for the missionary or for the monastery or the religious orders. Just to give an idea, in case you get the idea that the church was perfect back in the Middle Ages, it certainly wasn't. You had scurrilous letters being written to Rome. One priest would write about his neighbouring priest if he thought he had a better parish and he had his eye on it. He would write a scurrilous letter to Rome complaining about all the faults that his neighbouring priest had. We still give out about each other, priests in the diocese, but at least we don't write to Rome. So I think but that sort of scurrilous behaviour was going on all the time. And but as well as that, you had clerical families, and some of them that they held on to a particular parish or maybe even a particular religious community, and they dominated that, and the positions were passed on from father to son to grandson. So celibacy was largely ignored by quite a lot of the clergy right up until the 1600s. So you had these clerical families that you would find 4 generations of priests, some of them maybe even bishops, and some of them prior in Drumlane and that type of thing. So you had the rule of celibacy came in, I think, around the 12th century, around 1129 or something around then, but it only gradually came in and was applied with discipline in Breffni in the 1600s after the Reformation. So that's, I say, some of the families there, and it'll give you an idea, I suppose, of all of these families who lived in these areas in Breffni. Just to give you an idea of the sort of stuff that was going on, I just put down a couple of raids that we have information about, cattle raids and different things. And here we have Cathal O'Reilly and other marauders raided the manor of the Archbishop Cromer. Now this is the Archbishop of Armagh, and here the O'Reillys, good Catholics, going up and raiding his place in Julianstown over in County Meath. And they get severe penalties for it. They're excommunicated and they have to... so that was in August 1529. But we find again, only 5 years later, another one of the O'Reillys, Odie O'Reilly and Cormac Brady and others, steal 80 horses in Julianstown. So they weren't Mickey Mouse raids. They were going, and they had good sense as well, because sometimes, certainly this one in August here, they headed off when the cattle were well fed and good mead land, and they were well fed over the summer, and they were bringing them back to the poorer land in Cavan for the winter. So it was these raids. But what happened? It'll give you an idea, though, of the type of society it was, because intertribal wars between the different families, succession disputes within families, cattle raids into other territories, and wars with the English meant that life in Breffni in late medieval times was at times volatile and violent. So we mustn't romanticise what life was like in pre-Reformation times in Ireland. Here's Paddy was talking about the importance of art and getting an insight into history earlier with the letter from America. But here, one of the most famous German artist, Albrecht Dürer, painted this picture in 1521 of Irish soldiers. And again, you can see the two on the left here. They're hairy, they're beards, they're wild-looking, they have cloaks, long cloaks on them, and some of them, other ones that we have of this period, show them in bare feet as well. We think that these two soldiers here were probably galloglass professional soldiers, and they are better equipped for war. But they're all warlike, They all have the bows and arrows, the long spears, the hatchets, all of that. Not the sort of men you'd like to meet on a dark night. So you can get the picture then that somehow it was a different world and people looked very different and acted very differently than people do now. It was a warlike society. And yet within that, within this crazy, violent society, you had culture thriving. You had these learned families and the northwest, and this part of Breffni and Leitrim, thanks Tom, Breffni, places present-day County Cavan, Leitrim, South Donegal and Fermanagh were noted as being an area in Ireland where writing was flourishing, more so than anywhere else in Ireland. So it was Ray Gillespie that described it as an explosion of literary activity that took place in the late 15th and early 16th century in this part of Ireland. There were so many scribal families, learned families, poets, historians, legal experts who were writing at this time, and thankfully quite a few of the manuscripts have survived. I just give a couple of examples here. This one is in the Royal Irish Academy, and it's a pocket-sized early 16th century book with medical and religious notes, a genealogical poem on Breffni families, and a pedigree of St. Meog, one of Breffni's most famous saints. So this was early 16th century. This one here is in the British Library, and it's a manuscript made in the late 1480s by the McPartlin scribal family from Tullyhaw. So again, Second Life, there were a lot of lives of the saints were being written at this time as well, St. Malatia, St. Meog, different ones like that. And they were very often written in the vernacular and were based on earlier Latin texts, usually from the 12th century or so. But writing was fiercely important and very much thriving in this part of Ireland, despite all of the violence. And you have to say as well that families like the O'Rourke's in West Breffni and the O'Reillys and different families were great patrons of the arts. And you find that with the chalices that they commissioned, but also the many art families that the O'Dahleys were one of the O'Reillys poets, and they were paid by their patrons, and that system collapsed as well, of course, with the collapse of the Irish chieftains. So just another picture. This is another image from about 1575 by Lucas de Heer. He was a Flemish artist. But again, it gives us a good insight. There were no cameras at the time, but this gives us an insight into what Irish people might have looked like at the time. And Paddy was mentioned earlier in the letter where the young girl who was reading the letter from America was barefooted. But here we see everybody's barefooted. They were tough people, and they very often wore no shoes at all, winter or summer. But the men nearly always wore the long cloaks. They had these beards, long hair, and the women also wore long cloaks and went barefooted as well. So it was, to the outsider, they did appear uncivilized, and yet it was within that culture was actually thriving as well, when we see from writing and stuff. But they were always armed, the men nearly always armed these weapons and big swords and spears and stuff like that. So again, we learn from art. It gives us some idea of what the Irish looked like around this time. Here's more of the same artist's work here. Again, you see here two men, the same, the long cloaks on them, but also the big swords and the beards and the moustaches. There's a lovely incident that there were complaints made about two priests from the Diocese of Kilmore that were wearing beards and moustaches and long hair, and they were being censored, trying to get them to dress a bit more in the English style. So we find that again in the late 1400s, that there's this attempt And of course here, this one here is a telling picture here, because you have this wild-looking Irish man with the beard and the cloak and the bare feet, and you have this civilised, in inverted commas, woman from the Pale reaching out to him, trying to civilise him and bring him into a more modern world. And you can see she's dressed beautifully, and not that unlike modern style dress. But also you see that she has the cross here round her neck, the implication being that she is Christian and that he is not, that he needs to be brought into the Christian fold as well. So we learn quite a bit from these at the time. So that's a brief insight, I suppose, into what they might have looked like and the type of houses and places they lived back in the 1500s. This here is a famous map of Cavan Town that was made about the year 1590, and it's a work of art in itself, and it always deserves attention to anybody looking at this period in Breffni. Up here at the front, the town of the Cavan. Lovely banner, beautifully done here on top. It shows O'Reilly's castle up here on Tullochmongan, on top of the hill, looking down on the town, prominent on one of the little hills up at the top. And then if we go down here, right down, this is Main Street, and this is Abbey Street here. And the main structure of the medieval town is still there. The Main Street is still there. You had the town cross in the middle of the junction between Main Street and Abbey Street, and then there was another little path, a road that went straight up to the castle on top. And here, and we'll take a closer look at this later on, you have the Franciscan Friary, which was established about the year 1320 or so, and survived until the late 1500s. So the main features then, O'Reilly's Castle and the Franciscan Friary of Cavan Town is still in place in 1590, even though Reformation has happened 50 years earlier or so. But Cavan is still largely unaffected by it until this period. So this is, I suppose, showing us the old world that is about to change, and change fairly radically. So O'Reilly's Castle is still there, but not for long more. So we're looking at change then in East Breffni. Breffni changed to County Cavan, and that transition, I suppose, has been described, I suppose, as the Anglicisation of East Breffni, and that there was a gradual process of Anglicisation that happened. And I suppose it gradually came from, the east of the county, from bordering with Meath, and gradually it's areas like Glengevelin that Brendan is going to talk about later. They were still speaking Irish into the 1900s. So it'll give you an idea that the complete Anglicisation, it took a long time, but it gradually happened. And of course, there was lots of links. I mentioned earlier about the MacBradys, who were businessmen trading with the Pale and stuff like that. But you also had members of the O'Reillys who were they were abbots in Kells Friary, the Augustinian, or Kells Abbey. So you had that link all the time, and also with families in the Pale, intermarriage, Nugents and different ones like that. So that Anglicisation process was going on, but it certainly speeded up around this period. So 1579 was a crucial point. East Breffni is shired and becomes County Cavan. So it's now this county system is gradually being put in place, and the old territories of Breffni are gradually receding. Although it's interesting that this here, the map here from 1590, also has a reference to Breffni rather than to County Cavan. So 1583 is a turning point as well. Connealach O'Reilly dies, and all hell breaks loose because there's a succession war about who's going to take over from him. And this is the Irish families. It wasn't primogeniture, that somehow any one of the descendants could become the new chieftain. So this led to chaos within Breffni. Then you had the 9 Years' War, and then 1603, the chieftains defeated, the Treaty of Mellifont, the Ulster chieftains defeated, and then 1607, the flight of the Earls, which was traumatic psychologically for the whole Irish psyche, and the end of an era. The old system has collapsed, and now we're into a new era of Anglicisation. And of course, you also then, of course, had the plantation of Ulster taking place as well, where families move in and take over. But just to give you an idea of the collapse of the school, or of the castle here on the top, in 1608, the proposal is to build a new Cavan Royal School with stones from Turkmongan Castle. So that encapsulates, I suppose, the change that's happening. Royal schools have been set up in different parts of Ulster, and this one here, this is what they're proposing. So the castle is dismantled at this stage. So O'Reilly no longer holds sway in County Cavan. Just to look at the Franciscan Friary, what we've done here is turn the map around, and you can see the Breffni or Breffni on this side as well. So it was intended to be looked at and from different angles. Here you have the Franciscan Friary here. This is Main Street, and the Abbey lands here as well. So again, complete change for the monasteries and for the parishes at this time. We just look at it briefly. 1590, the Inquisition in Cavan found that the monastery of Cavan belong and ought to pertain to our said lady, the Queen. That's Queen Elizabeth I. So this is now 1590, more than 50 years after the Reformation, and yet the monastery was still in religious hands, but not for long more. 1591, the friary and attached lands are granted to Edmund Barrett. So for the first time now, lay people own the religious orders. We find the same with the other two in Drumlane, and also at Holy Trinity Abbey. They too are transferred into lay hands. And we find in 1594 that Captain James Dowdall is using the Franciscan Friary as a military barracks during the 9 Years' War. So then 1608 the friary is burned, and then 1610 the Friary Chapel is to be used as a Church of Ireland parish church, which continues until the present church just across the way here was opened, I think on Christmas Day in 1815. So all change for both the civil and religious. So looking at Anglicisation of East Breffni, just put in a picture there, I suppose, of Farnham House, which I suppose captures this Anglicisation, but also the planting of Cavan and other Ulster counties. Plantation of Ulster County Cavan lands granted mostly to English and Scottish undertakers, but also to native Irish. And we must remember that some of the native Irish were granted some of the O'Reilly families, McBrady families were granted large plots of land at this time as well. Key point then, another key point after the plantation of Ulster is the end of the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland. And the last phase of that took place at Clogher Castle. So Cavan was the last of that strong building that we saw earlier. And we find on the 27th of April 1653, Philip McHugh O'Reilly surrenders Clogher Castle to Cromwellian forces, paving the way for further transfer of land ownership. So churches and lands are now owned by the established church. And we find the poet Lachlan O'Dawley, one of the poets to the O'Reillys, wrote a famous poem in 1615, Ga Arch or Ga na Gael, where are the Irish? In other words, he's saying we have English and Scottish. Now, where are the native Irish? They have been dispossessed from their lands. So a system of landlord and tenant farmers throughout Cavan. And this feeds into the whole emigration that others will be talking about later as well. The land system where most of the land is owned by large landowners, and most of the land is worked by tenant farmers who have small plots of 10, maybe 15 acres of land to work. So this is a dramatic change. So the Church of Ireland is the established church as by law established. And because of that, they're not very tolerant of any other denomination. And we see this here in what is now County Cavan. For instance, in 1614, we have an account of Thomas and Anthony Kiernan and 7 others imprisoned for 6 months in horrific conditions in Cavan jail for the crime of being present at the sacrifice of the Mass. So this Jesuit letter that was describing this, and we have great details about the conditions that they were in, were quite horrific conditions. They were that they were living in darkness and were being fed food in through little holes in the prison door. So that was 1614. Then we find in 1660 that, or about that year, that William Edmondson, Quaker leader, was first put in stocks in Belturbet before being imprisoned in the same horrific conditions in Cavan jail. And he and some of his followers were jailed for 14 weeks for the crime of being Quakers. Now, they were objecting to some of the rules of the time, but they were generally peace-loving people. So that's the Quakers. And then we find in 1712 that 10 Presbyterian ministers arrested in Belturbet for endeavouring to disturb the peace where no dissenting preacher had hitherto been settled. So the Presbyterian Church were trying to establish a church in Belturbet, and it had been controlled by the Church of Ireland, and they boasted that there was nobody except Church of Ireland people within the town walls. So here you have this, they are now jailed, and this causes a huge furore when they are arrested and jailed for a short while. So you can see it's not a place where it's easy for other denominations to survive. So we're getting there, we're nearly there. Just Presbyterian immigration, I say I'm no expert on this, but just to make a few points about it, that sometimes it's the type of immigration that's neglected maybe more than the Roman Catholics who immigrated in huge numbers from the famine time onwards. But there was immigration much earlier and the 1700s. But we also forget that there were not just one famine, but that famine conditions weren't far away at any time throughout the 1700s, and particularly in the late 1720s and 1730, around that period. So, but the Presbyterians had some of the same difficulties that Catholics or other denominations had. They resented having to pay tithes to the Church of Ireland clergy. They resented the sacramental test, that is, having to provide written proof that they had received the Lord's Supper according to the usage of the Church of Ireland. So in previous times there were accustomed fines for people who didn't attend the Church of Ireland services, and now we have the Presbyterians having to provide proof as well. And there was an eruption of mostly Presbyterian-led violence in Cavan and Monaghan in the summer of 1763, when a group called the Hearts of Oak rebelled, and were quite successful in the early part of the rebellion until Charles Coote suppressed it in the summer of 1763. So you can see the Presbyterians are not too happy with their lot. But I go back to this point here, that poor harvest, rising rents and famine conditions were the main factors contributing to Presbyterian immigration to the New World at this time. And I think Paddy would probably agree with that there were famine conditions and there were poor harvests for about 3-4 years on the trot in the late 1720s, and that you had whole communities at times of Presbyterians would leave as a group together to start the New World. And of course they made a huge impact in Canada and in the present-day United States. So I think this is our last picture to have, and just a brief look at the famine, because I just wanted to lead in maybe to Mary's talk this afternoon as well on famine and post-famine immigration. The system of land ownership, where landlords own large tracts of land and tenant farmers worked small poor holdings, was established before 1700. So that system was already in place. Of the land system was at the root of a lot of the poverty, and though mass immigration would not happen until later. Here there's something that needs to be looked at a bit more, I think, are the graphics in newspapers like the London Illustrated News, where there's wonderful graphics of Ireland in pre-camera, pre-photographic period. And this one here shows emigration scene, where there's people ready to emigrate, and here you have the clergyman blessing somebody as they're preparing to depart. You have some of them are crying, and I say probably after an American wake, probably early in the morning, heading off to emigrate. But these pictures, and there's others as well in London Illustrated News and in other journals, wonderful graphics depicting some of the realities of life back then. So just a few pointers about it, and I say then I'm going to shut up. And oops, damage. We need to go back one here. Just a few pointers about the emigration, I suppose, that mostly gets most attention, that is post-famine emigration. But to understand mass emigration, we need to look at, one, the rapidly increasing population. Population increasing incredibly rapidly, large families and that sort of thing. Subdivision of small holdings. So if a tenant farmer had 20 acres and he had 2 sons, he divided up into 2 10-acre holdings. Next generation liable to divide up again. Tenant farmers getting smaller and smaller plots. Dependence on the potato for food. And of course then, once the blight comes, that's disaster. But hunger, poverty and want, which are very often what force people to move in any era, but particularly here in Ireland, the hunger, poverty and want that was there, they were the main causes. And of course the Great Famine triggered off incredible emigration from this country at that time. So my apologies for throwing so much stuff at you in a short time, but hopefully it'll give you some sort of background and might help to. So thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Monsignor Liam, for that incredible tour through that period and delivering such a comprehensive amount of information. It's time for some questions for Liam and Paddy in relation to the Emerald Letter. If anyone has any thoughts about the heard this morning.
Well, I've been reading, going through some of this material relating to the pre-famine era and during the famine. And my understanding is at the time that the land was broken up into small areas, that it was most of it was around 2.5 to 3 acres the families lived on, and the 10 to 20 acres, now they were better off, although they didn't own anything, they just had a larger building. I just wondered, is that Cavan? Because that wasn't necessarily Cavan that I was looking at, it was Ireland in general.
Yeah, there were some cottiers had nearly no land at all. They might have half an acre, maybe just enough for a garden or stuff like that. But others had, I'd say, I haven't the figures with me, but certainly some had as low as 5 acres and some had up to 15 acres and stuff like that. Tom mentioned earlier, I did a small book during the pandemic on a great granduncle of mine who was killed at the beginning of the land war. And they lived in West Cavan, and they had a tenant farm of about 10 acres. And it was landing up in the Kilka Mountains, and you wouldn't know how anybody lived even if they had 100 acres, never mind 10, how they lived on it. But he was shot by a landlord at the beginning of the land war, and they were protesting that about a family being evicted at the time. So the small farms, but also the failure to rotate crops was a big thing. They were growing potatoes on the same crop 1 year after another, and they needed to rotate crops and to give the ground a chance. I think that is part. So that added to the small. But Paddy, do you want to say anything?
No,
yeah.
Did they become owners of that small acreage? The 5 acres?
Yeah, eventually. The land war started 1879 or so, and you could argue that it continued for nearly 20, 30 years, 25 years. And there were a whole series of land acts. The farmers got organised. Michael David, Parnell, started the Land League, and they became organised and began to fight for their rights. And there were various land acts then, right up until about 1904, 1905, that gradually they were able to buy out so they then became, most of them owned their land. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Father Mary Friedel is my name. I'm a Cavan girl in a Dublin woman, and I must say that I read your book on the land war, and I must say I enjoyed it, and I found it so well referenced. It was absolutely wonderful to read, and a great reference book to have indeed. But the one thing I learned as a result of that, growing up in Ballyconn, I was always aware that somehow that Catholic and Protestant families integrated very well and got on very well, and that was my memory. And I could never understand why, to go to Ballinamore, that it was a much more nationalist, I would call it.
Yes.
My understanding of republic was more the French,
Yes.
so I don't like using that word.
Yes.
You describe, your book actually, the whole issue about the land war and the landlord's behaviour inside Leitrim explained all of that to me, and thank you very much for that.
And an interesting thing that part of that was the migration of people from Ulster to Leitrim and other Connaught counties, particularly in 1795 and 96. There were huge numbers went down after the Battle of the Diamond, and they settled on the mountains in West Cavan, Leitrim, Sligo, and even over into Mayo. And if you look at all of those areas, republicanism has thrived in the areas where most of those families settled, which is an interesting way of looking at it. So the resentments, my own family they were ejected from Ballinamallard area, Fermanagh at that time, and the tradition carried on. They knew exactly when they came and where they went to and all of that. That continued. So that was fed into it as well. Not just the land system, but actually the resentment had been ousted from.
Supplementary, if I may. When you're talking about, I'd love to be able to access all that information. And as somebody who's not on top of the system here in Cavan, how accessible is that to somebody who's interested, or is there any means by which my own grandmother was Fox from
Yes.
as well? So,
well, there's a great genealogy centre here. And,
what way does, is it a case of coming in and just talking, or what way does that work?
Well, you can come in, or you can phone, make an appointment, and just ascertain exactly what information you have and what you're doing, So that's the best thing to do. Just phone, talk to some of the genealogy people here today, and just make the groundwork.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yes, George.
Ian, thank you very much for a very informative. Just one question. How closely did East and West Breffni align with present-day Leitrim and Cavan? Or was the border fluid?
And I think Brendan might talk about this a bit more later on as well. It was fluid at times, and I mean the high point, I suppose, was in the 12th century when Tiernan Mór O'Rourke was the chieftain of all of Breffni, and it stretched from the Sligo coastline almost to Kells and even farther into Meath as well. And so it was huge at that stage, and it was that stage that Kilmore Diocese was set up, and that's why we still have that remnant today, that a small part of Meath is in Kilmore Diocese and a small part of Sligo is in Kilmore Diocese. So it was fluid, but also the borders between East and West was fluid, and I think Leitrim should be a bigger county than it is today, but Brendan will chat about that later on. So it was fluid, and Ballyconnell, Mary, was sometimes the border between East and West Breffni rather than farther west, so, but again, Brendan will fill you in on that.
I'm here from America to learn all this.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.
And part of the diaspora.
Yes.
So my great-grandmother came from Cavan. She was born in 1841, but she did not read or write, yet the picture depicted a kid being able to read and write. And from what I can gather, her brothers and sisters who also came to America, none of them were able to read and write. So why, you know?
I guess that's for me.
Yeah, that is.
It's really a hard question. No, basically that's to do with the chronology. If she, 1841, so the national schools had only been enacted, legislated for a decade before. So you really see the fruits, as I put it, of mass increasing literacy in English coming through in the 1860s and 1870s. Brennan painted that in 1875. So by that stage, what you're seeing is young children of 10 or 11 increasingly having literacy in English, but the full weight of the introduction of the national schools in a wider European context is very precocious. I mean, Ireland is blessed with a really impressive national school system at a very early point, 1831, but the full impact hasn't really been felt at a local level in rural Ireland until maybe a generation later.
Okay, thank you.
Time for maybe one more question or so, yeah?
When did they come into Cavan Huguenots?
I'm not able to answer that. I don't know if anybody else had here any.
Huguenots come in after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, the end of religious toleration for French Protestants, and they're largely encouraged to come in by the state in Ireland because they have high skills, many attractive features. I don't think, from what my knowledge would be, that they weren't particularly strongly represented in Cavan. There would have been some, but the bulk of the settlement would have been in the Irish Midlands and Dublin. And there's still, interestingly, I was at it last week, it's called Huguenot Cemetery, just beside the Shelford Hotel in Dublin there, which is of course one of the outcomes of that Huguenot intervention. But not I think, oddly enough, again I'm going too long with this, but the first school I attended in Armagh City was the Drellancourt School, which had been set up again by a Huguenot immigrant from Western France. So, okay.
Thank you very much.
When was the national language, which was Irish, when was that changed to being taught to the people as English? When was the changeover done?
The changeover obviously was very gradual. It was very gradual, but I think it was about 1730, I need to check now, but that the local Church of Ireland bishop here was talking to his clergy, and he was encouraging them to go out and to talk to the natives and to encourage them to come to services. But he said at that stage that you don't need an interpreter anymore because they will understand your language. So that was about 1730. But then I was saying that in Glengeddon they were still speaking Irish into the 1900s. And what Paddy mentioned there earlier about the Stanley Act, the national school system, it taught English, not Irish initially, and that had a big impact on it. And sometimes it was seen as a way of making progress in life that you needed to speak English if you wanted to be involved in commerce or business or law or whatever. But it was a very gradual process. So that process of Anglicisation that started really in the, I suppose you could say, in the 1500s, continued for hundreds of years, really. Yeah.
And much later in the West.
And much later in the West. And of course you still have pockets of Gaelic in the West. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Just got one myself, actually.
Okay.
My great-grandparents lived here to go to New Zealand. I'm from New Zealand. So,
You're welcome.
Thank you. So they would have been speaking Gaelic all the way through. Would they have known any English, or because when they got on these certificates, they just had their marks, so we didn't know whether they're...
Quite possibly, I can't answer, that, but quite possibly that they did speak Irish and that they couldn't read or write, quite possibly. And I think something that it's very hard to understand is the culture shock for somebody from Breffni who never moved more than 10 miles from home in their life. And suddenly they're going not just to Cove or to somewhere, to a port, but have to travel on these ships and go very often living in cities that must have been terrifying and an incredible culture shock.
Yes, they went to England and then they went
Yes, yes.
from there to New Zealand.
So you can imagine these people who lived up in rural Ireland and in a very, closed sort of society are now meeting all these challenges. I mean, it's an incredible tribute to the resilience that they were able to live new lives in such a different world. Yeah.
Okay, we'll conclude with that. Thanks very much, David. Thanks very much. We'll break for coffee now and resume at about 11:15. If anybody has any special dietary requirements, just make that information known to those serving food. Thank you very much.
Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling.
think we're good to go. I know you have a lot to talk about, so maybe at the lunch break you get a chance. Thanks very much. Just want to thank Chapter 1 for the providing the food today, and also Concepta and Jane and the genealogy staff for the admin and all the library staff. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Brendan Scott. Brendan is a very busy man. He is currently manager of the Irish Family History Foundation and its website Roots Ireland. He is historian in residence with Cavan County Council under the Decade of Centenaries programme, and is a part-time lecturer in Maynooth University in medieval and early modern Irish history. And in his spare time, he is editor of Breffni, the Journal of Common Shanachas Breffni, and he also helps his wife Tara with his daughters Eva and Murren. As historian in residence, he has delivered and facilitated lectures, podcasts and school talks, and has just produced 4 Lives Lost, a book on 4 of Cavan's revolutionary dead 1920 to 1922. He has numerous publications and journal articles to his name, including Religion and Reformation in the Tudor Diocese of Meath, published by the Four Courts Press. He prepared R.J. Hunter's The Ulster Port Book 1612 to 1615 for publication in 2022. With Dr. Jonathan Cherry, he has edited Cavan History and Society, published 2014, and also Leitrim History and Society, edited with Monsignor Liam, who we heard this morning, and published 2019. We are very fortunate in Cavan to have Brendan, because he is able historians like him are very rare, and Brendan has the gift of being able to deliver fast, accurate and thorough research. So I'll introduce you now to Brendan, who is going to talk about the kingdom within the county, Landgavin.
Thank you very much, Tom. No pressure after all that. Speaking of my daughters, Murren, my second, is 5 today, and she said to me this morning, "Can you not cancel this thing, Daddy?" And I said, "No, sorry." So
what I said.
So not today. So anyway, that's me. Yeah, happy birthday, Murren. She's probably going to be looking at it. So before I do start, I just want to introduce 2 ladies here on my side, Mary Boreham and Bridget Clasham. They work on a project called the Landed Estates Project, and they had been doing, I think you started off with Connacht, would that be right? And now they've moved into Ulster, so Cavan has been put up, and I was looking at it a few days ago and it looks great. And so Mary and Bridget will be here for the next couple of days, and I think they're speaking in the morning as well, I think, yeah. So if you have any questions about any of the local estates around this part of the woods, please ask them, because they've done a great job in putting it all together. And I know Mary many years. Mary worked in the, what did we call it, the reading room, in the Special Collections reading room in NUI Galway, as it was then, many years ago, when I had more hair on my head. So it's lovely to see Mary up in Cavan today.
They wanted to look at it overnight.
Yeah. So if anyone wants to have a look at that web, is it landedestates.ie?
Landedestates.ie.
Yeah. So if you want to have a look at that, have a look, and as I say, they'll be around for questions.
Have you done any research on Leitrim and know of it already? Leitrim has been up for many years, but Cavan has only recently gone up. Monaghan and Donegal are on the start. And we'll be here tomorrow for the workshop as well, so people have things they want to ask.
Thank you, Mary. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I called it the kingdom within the county, which I hope will become clear as we go along. So, on the 4th of January 2013, a local newspaper based in the northwest of Ireland carried a report under the following headline, and the report read, "Report reveals Black Lion community feels isolated." A Cavan community forum in Black Lion in West Cavan in late 2012 had revealed that that community, as I say, located in the northwest of the county, felt isolated from the rest of Cavan. A number of issues were discussed by the forum, one of which was the then current Garda presence in Black Lion. Locals informed the forum that Ballyconnell's Garda station, which was about 41 kilometres over mountainous terrain, had taken over the jurisdiction of the area from Manorhamilton Garda station, which, even though Manorhamilton's in Leitrim, it was only about 22 kilometres from Black Lion. The locals were unhappy with this new situation, feeling that the inevitably longer response time from Ballyconnell would be further hampered by inclement weather and bad roads through the Quilca Mountains during the winter months. The forum was informed by the people of Blacklion that, quote, guarded jurisdiction should be decided upon by response time and not county boundaries. They were also unhappy with the new political boundaries. If you remember at that time, the political boundaries were redrawn, as the new Sligo-Leitrim constituency would also incorporate West Cavan and South Donegal. And a question posed by the community at that meeting was, who will we turn to now to represent our needs as West Cavan people? Unhappy with this new measure regarding the boundaries, the community put forward a motion instead to move to retain Cavan County Council as sovereign representative body for West Cavan. The newspaper article also reported that the issue of isolation and what they called, in inverted commas, unbelonging to the rest of Cavan due to the obstacle of the Quilca Mountains was also noted. And this article, reported in a local newspaper, highlighted the concerns of the West Cavan community that they were forgotten and cut off from the rest of County Cavan. And these fears were real enough, and the community had a point. The local newspaper which reported this event and the concerns that West Cavan was becoming isolated from the rest of Cavan, was not the Anglo-Celt, the Cavan newspaper, but rather the Leitrim Observer. The Anglo-Celt didn't cover the meeting, nor did they report it in any following issues, which in some ways I think sort of proves the point that the community there were making. We'll just working? No. How do we?
Just put it on the side.
Oh, you turned it off?
There's everything on the side.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. So just to give you an idea of what's going on here, this is the area that I'm talking about here. Obviously Cavan, and then this is the area here, basically Tully Hall, the barony of Tully Hall. And then when we come in through, this is the road I took this morning, coming down here through Glen Gap. This is Glen Gevlin here, Blacklion up there, which obviously is right on the border with the north. You cross the bridge and you're into Belcoo, and then over this side then is Dowra, which is just on the Cavan-Leitrim border. In fact, half of Dowra is in Cavan and half it's in Leitrim. So in many ways, West Cavan, particularly those villages that I've just talked about, Blacklion, Dowra and Glan, have closer geographical and social links with counties Leitrim, Fermanagh and even with Sligo than they do with their own native County Cavan. Charles Coote in 1802 declared that Tully Hall, that barony I've just mentioned, differs extremely from the features of the rest of the county and more resembles those of Leitrim or Fermanagh. A reference to the map of Ulster will show that it more properly belongs to Leitrim, and we'll look at that map in a moment. So in this paper I want to discuss how the West Cavan enclave is almost a separate jurisdiction or a kingdom, as the people of Glengevlin like to say, from the rest of the county. It's known as the Kingdom of Glan. Unlike the Kingdom of Kerry or the Republic of Cork, both of which monikers served to unite the county against the rest of the country, the notion of a Kingdom of Glan actually has the effect of disassociating itself from Cavan, not from the country as a whole. Now, I should say at this point that I have some skin in the game here. My wife is a McGovern from Glengevlin. We live in the neighbouring parish of Balnaglera in Leitrim. My children go to the national school in Glan. My wife is the teacher there, so that is where they go. So I'm steeped in Glan life and lore, and I find it an endlessly fascinating place and a beautiful place, full of wonderful people and great characters. So it's a place that I've known for over 20 years intimately, and it's a wonderful place. Now, we had Father Liam talking this morning about the Gaelic lordship of East Breffni and West Breffni. And up until the shiring of the lordship in the late 1570s into what is now County Cavan, the region East Breffni was part of Connacht, not Ulster. But for administrative reasons, the Tudor government placed the newly created county of Cavan into Ulster in 1579. But even earlier, in 1562, the Earl of Sussex, who was the Lord Lieutenant in Ireland at the time, he wrote that O'Reilly's country, i.e. Cavan, was taken to be in Connacht, but because it lieth fitter for another government and bordereth on the Pale, I leave it out of the government of Connacht. So it was too far over east for it to have it in Connacht. Like, it borders on the Pale, and that's part of the thing. I think the Father Lee was talking about, some people were talking about language this morning. I mean, like O'Reillys from Cavan would be driving cattle up as far as Kells and Navan to the markets. So in order to sell your cattle to people in the Pale, you have to be able to speak some measure of English, or they have to be able to speak some measure of Irish. So there's obviously an element of bilingualism going on at that time. So at this point, Cavan comes into Ulster, but before that it had been seen as part of Connacht. And even in 1585, 5-6 years after the shiring of County Cavan, Magaran country, which is that West Cavan bit that I've just looked at, was claimed by the O'Rourke's of Leitrim as what they call a vassal territory, that it was under their control. And that was acknowledged that year by the Tudor administration, that part of Cavan was actually under O'Rourke control. And the Magaran chieftain attended O'Rourke, the chief of the O'Rourke family, in Drumahare in 1585, which was basically the equivalent of Magaran, bending the knee, taking the knee in the company of his superior. Now, although the most western part of Tullyhaw was shired into the rest of Cavan, I'm not sure, like Charles Coote, that it should have been. Its remoteness meant that the O'Reilly family, which were based in Cavan town here, never really had any great foothold in that area, which was ruled by the Gaelic clan, the Magarans, as they were known then, and now McGovern. In 1542, Brian O'Rourke of West Breffni met with the chief of the O'Reillys, the Lord Deputy, and the Privy Council. So they met with the Tudor government, and this was what they met about. This is a quote: was touching all contentions between him and O'Reilly about the lands called Tullyhaw, Magaran's lands. So there's an argument going on between the O'Reillys and the O'Rourkes as to who has lordship in this particular area. Now, nothing happened about that above commission. It was kicked down the road, as politicians can do. Nothing happened about it at that time. And in 1584, Sir John O'Reilly, who was a loyal Irishman, when I say loyal to the Tudor government, he surrendered Tullyhaw to the English government, and he was re-granted it. It was what my old teacher, Stephen Ellis, called Surrender and Regrant Mark II, which was you would surrender your Gaelic lands and titles, and then you would have them re-granted to you under English title. And so he surrenders Tullyhaw to the English, and the English accept that. Now, that was news to the O'Rourkes, who claimed Tullyhaw as their own at this time. In 1607, the O'Rourkes claimed again, quote, that beyond the memory of man, they had received a yearly rent of 12 cows or £12, which Magaran did at all time willingly pay until about 4 years previously. Now, willingly pay, and he paid it until 4 years up to that. So, then in 1610, as part of the preparations for the Ulster Plantation, the baronies of Cavan were mapped by the cartographer, a guy called Josias Bodley. And this is a detail of the Tullyhaw map. And as you can see there, what it says is Largy and Dubally being, I don't know how many Ballybettles, that's a measurement of land. This land is in controversy between this county and the county of Leitrim. So in other words, there's an argument still going on in the early 17th century under the plantation of Ulster as to what county this part of Cavan actually properly belongs in. Is it Leitrim or is it Cavan? So they haven't made up their mind at this point. Now, some medieval and early modern Gaelic analyst sources also place Tullyhaw in West Breffni, in what is now Leitrim, which, if you understand the geography of that area, probably makes more sense geographically from a topography sort of standpoint, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So even at this stage, they were in the early 17th century, 30 odd years after the county had been shired into the county that we know now. There were still rumblings about the suitability of placing parts of what we now regard as County Cavan in County Cavan. And during the 1641 Rising, the McGoverns raided large swathes of Leitrim, but they rarely got any further than Bomboy. You don't really hear of McGoverns coming much further than Bomboy, but they're going into Ballinamore and that sort of areas of North Leitrim, and they're destroying iron smelting works in Dubally and doing all these different sort of things. But they're not coming into the rest of Cavan so much. Again, geographically, it's probably made more sense. And as I said there a moment ago, when we come to the modern day, the village of Dowra is now split between Leitrim and Cavan, with kind of the town side, as you call it, in Cavan when you cross over the bridge. But if you keep left to where there's more housing and the school, that's in Leitrim. So when you're driving from Glangevlin into Dowra, you go through a couple of patches that are Leitrim before you get back into Cavan again, and then likewise, if you keep left, you remain in Leitrim. And it's interesting as well that memory of Cavan being part of Connacht remained in some memory, because in 1920, during the War of Independence, when there's more than rumblings about partition happening, the Fermanagh-based paper, the Impartial Reporter, which was unionist, very impartial, referred to Cavan as not in the ancient Ulster, it was in Connacht. So they're kind of saying, well, you're on your own, lads. They're quite willing to throw the Cavan loyalists under the bus in this stage, if it meant safeguarding the position of unionism in what became the 6 counties. So they're using that historical precedent 300 years on, saying, well, Cavan was always part of Connacht, so let it go back to Connacht. The hell to Connacht kind of takes a different meaning on there. Now, so as I said, there are 6 baronies in Cavan: Lochtee, where we are at the moment, Clonmahon, Tullygarvey, Castlerahan, Tullyhunco, Clanky and Tullyhaw. But if you look at the Tullyhaw barony from the Quilca Mountains westward, as I say, it reveals that there's less kind of reason geographically and socially for that part of Tullyhaw to actually be in Cavan. In terms of accessibility, nowadays it's in reality much closer to Carrick-on-Shannon in Leitrim or Enniskillen in Fermanagh than Cavan itself. I mean, it's much easier if you're doing your weekly shop to go to Carrick-on-Shannon from Glan or to Enniskillen than to go down to Cavan to do that sort of thing. And the only route into Cavan, into Glangevlin from Cavan town, unless you want to go a real circuitous route, is through Glan Gap, a regional road, the R200, through, it's known on the thing as Bella Valley Gap. It's also known as Bale Valley Gap. It's also known as Glan Gap, but everyone up there calls it the Gap. So it's been shortened down to the Gap. And that has always led to issues of accessibility, because it's a poor road. If you get stuck, that's about the only bit of road. If you get stuck from Dernacrieve, if anyone knows where Dernacrieve is, if you turn off left, instead of going for Swanlin Bar, you go left to go up the mountain. If you get stuck behind a slow coach or a tractor between there, this is about the only bit of road. And I notice it's a continuous white line, so you really shouldn't, but
This is being recorded.
Yeah, don't do that, folks. That's about your only chance of getting beyond some guy who's going 20 miles an hour, looking in every field to see how many cows they have in that field and so on. So yeah, that's your chance. So make a break for it at this point, okay? Otherwise you'll be stuck. And in 1802, Charles Coote, who was writing about the county, noted the poor state of the roads there, and he said that the roads in this country are terribly bad indeed, but no worse than they were up here. And this is something that Father Liam was talking about earlier, that the road system was pretty non-existent up to this. And Glan, to this day, as I say, it can be a tricky road if you don't know it. I remember learning to drive and driving up through Glan, and you'd just be tired. There's so many corners, and oh God, and it was so easy driving through a town where you just have to stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. But going around these corners, now I know it now, but back in the day, it was fairly hairy at times. And if you just look at these, this is a cutting from the Anglo-Celt in 2010, 3-metre snow wall in Glan Gap. That's Peter McVitie there on the right, the councillor. Now he's well over 6 foot, and he has his hand on the snow. Now you can't see it so well, but the snow goes up well beyond him there. And so that was in 2010. I remember well the snow that year. It was diabolical. It was funny because I would never have ventured out, living in the lowlands of Belturbet, I wouldn't have ventured out in anything like that. And then in Glan, it was like, just go slowly. Just don't brake. First gear, second gear, you'll be fine. So that's what I've done ever since. And they are right, actually. If you do that, you'll be fine. And this is another one. Tom Sullivan sent me this photo. That's in Glangap in 2013, and again, that guy is over 6 foot as well.
That's John Gilheany.
John Gilheany, yeah.
He's the road overseer for the council.
Yeah.
He's just highlighting.
Yeah, just the height of that snow, and if you just see the amount of track that's available, there's only a little bit. You're driving on the line, going up through that, you know. So you know, so you can imagine that's what it's like in the 21st century. Can you imagine what it was like in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, 19th century? So it could be pretty bad. So following on from what I mentioned a moment ago, the McGovern clan, although residing in what is now County Cavan, were never really under the rule of the O'Reilly family, despite their claims, you know, that they were on. Like, you can say whatever you like, but what happens on the ground can be very different to what's reality. So rather, they were under the sway of the O'Rourke's in Leitrim and the Maguires of Fermanagh. And just outside Glangap, we have this lovely formation here, Maguire's chair. It's not O'Reilly's chair, it's Maguire's chair. And part of the folklore attached to that stone states, like you find it certainly in the school commissions of the 1930s, the folklore commissions, it states that it was an inauguration point or where the Maguire chieftain would sit in judgment on various cases. And Coote says as well that the foot of Quilca in 1802, Coote says this, the foot of Quilca was used to crown the head of the Maguires. And it was also those stories from the 1930s, the folklore stuff, says that it was also the location of a mass rock. Because if you're ever at that point, you can see all around, you can see into the basin of Cavan from there. It's a great viewpoint just there. So while there's no proof for any of those claims, bar folklore that comes from 100 years later, it does imply the reach that the Maguires also had into Tully Hall, Barony, which the O'Reillys didn't have. And this is an excerpt from the Book of McGovern, which is a 14th century manuscript now in the National Library. And it's a collection of praise poetry. And it was compiled by the McPartland family of Tully Hall, who were writers, which Father Liam alluded to earlier on. And the McGovern family paid this poet family to write nice things about them, as you do. And so they were great. The McGoverns were the best people that ever walked. And you know, and how much are you paying me? Oh yes, they were very, very nice people. But every Gaelic family, every major Gaelic family did this. And so the McGoverns were no different. But it's the earliest one that we have that survives to this day. I took a quick look through it. There's a printed version, which is probably a copy here. But there's one mention of the O'Reillys, 6 mentions of the O'Rourke's, 7 mentions of the O'Connors, which are further over, and 4 mentions of the O'Donnells from Donegal. And the reference to O'Reilly is a negative one, like we wish he'd go away, sort of a thing. So the O'Reillys really don't have much impact on the McGoverns during that medieval period up until the 15th century, when they start trying to make more inroads. The most important political relationships, sometimes good, sometimes negative, which the McGoverns had were with the O'Rourke's and with the Maguires in Fermanagh. Now, Nuala Gomerla, who is a well-known Gaelic scholar, he has conjectured that marriage connections between the highest echelons of the McGoverns and the O'Rourke's of Leitrim led to that book, such an important Breffni manuscript, ending up in the hands of a guy called Charles O'Connor, who was an 18th century antiquarian from Roscommon, whose mother was an O'Rourke. So the book seems to have ended up in O'Rourke hands, and O'Connor got it through those means. Marriage connections were far more likely between McGoverns and O'Rourke's of West Breffni than with any O'Reillys or with Brady's, say, or any of those. But nevertheless, there is an interesting little connect. There was a poem written in praise of the O'Reillys where the poet notes that he's in Glangevlin in 1599. He says, I'm in the gap known as Glangowlin, and that's in 1599. So we don't know who he was, but he was up there. You know, it could have been that he was getting some learning from the local scribal families, the local poet families in that area. We don't know. One of the other things when we kind of talk geographically as well are the proliferation of sweat houses in West Cavan and into Leitrim. I mean, you notice, like, you know, there's one there. All of them that are up in that area there. If anyone ever goes up to the Burren in West Cavan, you'll see their sweat houses along the way. And you can see how popular they are in kind of North Leitrim and then in that West Cavan area. Now, that map doesn't take in the ones in the north. but there's quite a few on that side of Fermanagh as well. And so again, they're quite common, and you see lots of mention of them in the folklore commissions in Glan and Black Lion and places like that as well. So county boundaries between West Cavan and North Leitrim meant little when it came to certainly the creation of these, or that tradition of the sweat house. And it's a funny thing, you know, Facebook now, you know, you get all these Facebook pages, but there seems to have been there was like a crisis of identity among a couple of Facebook users on a Glangavin Facebook page recently. Someone wrote up, "Glan is in Cavan," and just left it like that. There was no more explanation. And then another person wrote, "Glangavin is in County Cavan, not County Leitrim." 23 comments, 30 likes. So, you know, so obviously, I don't know what kicked that off. That's only about a month ago. I happened to see, I wonder what started that off. But anyway, so again, no one in Belturbet feels the need to put up a thing, Belturbet is in County Cavan. We know, you know. But it's interesting that was said there. Now, by the 19th century, that Glan area was being noted by commentators like Charles Coote in 1802 and Samuel Lewis in 1827 for its perceived poverty in relation to the rest of Cavan. And in 1802, I mean, the land, this is something again Father Liam was talking about earlier, you know, like how someone could even live on 100 acres of that mountainous territory. In 1802, Tully Hall was rated as the poorest barony in Cavan, with the rate of potato and flax per land valued at 3 to 4 guineas, as opposed to Tullygarvey, which was 5 to 8 guineas, and Loch T, which was 5 to 7 guineas per acre. And Samuel Lewis, in his topographical dictionary, now he didn't visit there himself, but someone gave him the lowdown on it, and he had this to say about Glan in 1827. Generally known as the Kingdom of Glan, but more properly called Glangavlin, or the country of the Magorans. To this isolated district, there is no public road and only one difficult pass. In some places, a trackway is seen by which the cattle are driven out to the fairs of the adjacent country. It is densely inhabited by a primitive race of Magorans and Dolans, who intermarry and observe some peculiar customs. They elect their own king and queen from the ancient race of the Magorans, to whom they pay implicit obedience. So this is, I mean, they're calling this like a kind of he's been quite sneery, I suppose, in a way about it. But really, that's just a throwback to the old Gaelic order. You know, there's nothing different in that. And if you had said, like Father Liam talked this morning about the new English order coming in, and if you had said to a Gaelic noble family that this English guy was looking down on them, I mean, you know, that wouldn't have played well. These are noble families. They can trace it. Like, if you want to talk about genealogy, the Gaelic Irish are obsessed with it. Their genealogies go on for pages and pages about who they are, the son of, 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 the son of. So, you know, this is only just a throwback to that old Gaelic political order, I suppose. And very nicely, quite recently, there's a guy, God rest him, he died a few years ago, Peter Third. He was known as Peter Third McGovern. He was made chieftain of the McGovern clan in 2003, and that's down at the Shannon pot, where the Shannon rises in Glan, and he's drinking water from the Shannon pot there. And so this is part of this sort of ceremony that they had. So I don't think there's one since. He died, as I say, a couple of years ago, and so I don't think there's been a new one elected since then. But again, it's a nice throwback. And the same thing happened in Cavan here. If you remember, J.J. O'Reilly was elected the chieftain of the O'Reillys there, 10 odd years ago, whenever it was. So it's a nice thing to go back to, actually. And so that was Peter. Now when we go then to 1836, John O'Donovan, who was working for the Ordnance Surveying, mapping out place names and all that sort of stuff, he was quite sarcastic, O'Donovan, so he made the following unflattering remarks about West Cavan as well. This is a long one. After having procured a kind of a dinner at the head inn of Swanlin Bar, wishing to lose no time in that uninteresting village, not very nice, we turned northwestwards to make our way into the centre of the wild valley of Glengavlin, a distance of 8 long Irish miles. This is the worst road and perhaps the wildest district I ever saw. Situated between the two lofty and barren mountains of Quilca and Slieve and Earn, this valley will never induce mankind to run a railroad through it. Its sides are precipitous and rocky, defying the exertions of the plough and the wheeled car, and even of the sidecar! ! Its roads, if road it might be called, is precipitous and stony, and intersected by many deep and rough glens with their mountain streams, now nearly dried up, which makes it very difficult to run a railroad from the city of Bomboy, Sarkiboy, to that of the Black Lion. So he's quite sarcastic, Mr. O'Donovan. If you read his letters, they're very entertaining. He's always complaining about something. Oh, you've put me up in a terrible inn. Oh, dinner, where's my money? He's always complaining about something. So I think it possibly was a wet day in Glan that day when he went up. He didn't like it so much. Now, so far, I suppose we have framed that isolation from the rest of Cavan in a slightly negative light. But it was precisely that isolation which was to prove a godsend during the years of the Great Famine from the 1840s. In 1837, it was noted in Glan that the sides of the mountains are generally cultivated for oats to a considerable height, and cattle graze on the mountaintops. So the reliance on potatoes, which prevailed through Cavan and most of the rest of the country, was not as total in Glangevlin. As I say, they grew oats just as much as potatoes. So when the potato failed in the 1840s, the level of starvation and death was not as high as it was in other parts of the county. If you look at the percentage drops there, the percentage drop in the 10 years between 41 and 51 is just over 19%. Tullyhunco is almost 28%. Tullygarvey drops almost 31%. So that gives you a good idea as to how it didn't drop as much there. And the barony with the highest population drop was Tullygarvey, as I say, with 31. That meant there was an average drop of people per square mile from 400 in 1841 to 277 in 1851. And Tullyhaw, on the other hand, experienced a drop from 175 people per square mile in 1841 to 142 in 1851. Now, it's a lower population, but still in all, the figures still, you're talking about percentages, so it works out. And then if we look at the figures of some town lands in Glan between 1841 and 61, Ardva town land, and this is a time when population is dropping across the board. 1 million dead, 1 million left the country in the 10 odd years of 1841 to 51. In Ardva, the population goes up from 76 to 84. Bellbally upward, that's around Glan Gap, that's from 58 to 90. Derry Lahan has a large one, 153 to 217. The other two, Doon McKeever, which is my wife's hometown land, a very small increase, and Gub just goes up one. But the point, they're not going down, So and as I say, particularly in Derry Lahan and Bellbally, quite significant increases in both those townlands. So it's interesting to see that, the combination of the hilly terrain there and the wet climate, which made for such difficult living conditions normally, actually forced those who were living there to eke out a more pastoral-based existence as well, which required, again, a smaller labour force as well. You didn't have as much farming, potatoes to do and things like that. And the availability of dairy produce and oatmeal further softened, as I say, the failure of the potato. So it made less of an impact in that area, leading to smaller population declines in the initial post-famine period. And there's also local folklore as well, which contends that people from all over Cavan and from neighbouring counties would travel to Glan looking for food. And so the situation there, certainly the feeling was that there was maybe a chance of getting food there where you mightn't be able to get it anywhere else. And when we talk about the famine, there's 3 workhouses open in Cavan during the famine, the one in Cavan town, just on the outskirts here, in Baileyborough and in Coothill. The workhouse in Bomboy in West Cavan, which we'll be visiting tomorrow, wasn't opened until around 1853, following the worst of the famine. The people of West Cavan belonged to the Enniskillen Poor Law Union, and rather than travel to Cavan workhouse, which would have been their nearest County Cavan workhouse, instead they go to Enniskillen, which much easier to get to. And even when more unions are created in 1850, including that of Bomboy, which takes in the entire barony of Tullyhaw, some people from that region still continue to go to Enniskillen workhouse rather than Bomboy one. Again, because it's easier to travel to Enniskillen than get over Glan Gap and get down into the rest of the county. And when we talk about language, and again, this is something that Father Liam mentioned earlier, in 1837, it was recorded that the English language is generally spoken in Cavan except in the mountain districts towards the north and west, which is Tullyhaw. And even there it is spoken by the younger part of the population. But the aged people all speak Irish, particularly in the district of Glan. And indeed, Glengevelin remained the Gaeltacht area with native speakers up until the early 20th century, the last part of Cavan to hold on to that tradition. And there was a Gaeltacht college set up there for a short time in the 1920s. People from all over Ireland and even abroad came from that. There are some recordings made of native speakers, I think maybe from the 30s, which ended up in Queen's. And my old teacher in Galway, Steve Ellis, who was an Englishman but married to a woman from Swanland Bar, and who did some of his, I think he did his PhD in Queen's, and was, even though he was from Yorkshire himself, speaks fluent Irish. He said he listened to some of these tapes because of his wife's interest in the area, and he said they were speaking Donegal Irish. It was more like a Donegal dialect than, the more southern Irish, which again makes sense. They're facing northwards rather than southwards. And there are many examples of that continued dislocation of West Cavan from the rest of the county. Everyone now who goes to primary school in Dowra and Blacklion, both of which obviously are in Cavan, although the school in Dowra is the primary schools in Leitrim, they all go now to secondary school in Drumcairn, Drumshambo or Manorhamilton, all in Leitrim. None of them go to a secondary school in County Cavan. That'd be their closest, like St. Mogues and Bomboy would be their closest secondary school. None of them go there. And why would they? The Leitrim ones are only a stone's throw or minutes away. Why would you be bothering going through, as I say, through all of Glan, down through Glan Gap, when you have far more accessible ones? And children now who now go to the school in Glengevelin, they're split between going to the secondary school in Bomboy or to schools in Manorhamilton or Drumcairn. And in a lot of time it sort of depends on if you're on the bus route. If you're on the bus route for Bomboy, you'll go to Bomboy School. But even then, there are some I can think of recently who were on the bus route and who still went to Drumcairn or Manorhamilton or places like that. So you're talking at least 90% of the children of West Cavan are getting their secondary school education outside County Cavan. And that means that a lot of those kids who then grow up into adults have no real knowledge of the rest of the county. Like, even though there is a secondary school in Belturbet, literally a 3-minute walk from where I grew up, I went to St. Pat's in Cavan, and I was always really glad that I did in a way, because you got a knowledge of people and places around the county which you wouldn't have gotten if it had just gone to the Tech in Belturbet. I'd have known the Belturbet people who I knew anyway, and then some from Milltown and maybe 1 or 2 from Killashandra and a few from Red Hills, basically the parish, and you wouldn't have, and the neighbouring parish. But going to St. Pat's, you got to know people from, all over. And so you're left with a better knowledge of people and places around the county. A steady, if small, number of people from West Cavan had formerly gone to school in St. Pat's or in Loretto. And in fact, the very first postulant which the Loretto order received when it opened Loretto College in 1930 was a Celia McGovern from Glengevelin, who went on to work in India her entire life. But those numbers have dried up completely, especially since the end of boarding in both schools. Loretto shut its boarding, I think, in the 80s, and St. Pat's in the late 90s. Between 1960 and 79, 43 boys from Glan, Blacklion, Swanland Bar and Dowra attended St. Pat's. Most of those probably boarding. But then from 1980 to 2000, 25 from that area went to St. Pat's. And in the 20 plus years since, there may be 1 or 2, but I can't think of them, to be quite honest with you, off the top of my head, who've gone. I think there's 1 from Blacklion, I think, that I can think of, none from Glengevelin that I can think of. I think one of the last students that went to St. Pat's from Glengevelin was in my brother's year, and he was 2 or 3 years older than me. So there were certainly none in my year, and none that I can think of below me. Possibly 1, I can't think of them. And again, if you look at the death reports, and the memorials that are in local newspapers, you can see how people from that area of West Cavan associate themselves oftentimes more with Leitrim than with Cavan. I took a 6-month period between November 2022 and April 2023, and I checked the Anglo-Celt and I checked the Leitrim Observer for either memorials or news of deaths for people from Glengevelin, Dowra and Blacklion. In that period, there were 53 notices for recent deaths or anniversaries of people from Glan, Dowra and Blacklion. There are 53 in the Leitrim Observer, and the Anglo-Celt had 36 of those people in their paper. So all those 36 were also in the Leitrim Observer. So that meant the 17 of them who were in the Leitrim Observer weren't in the Celt, the Cavan newspaper. And the implication of that, obviously, is that the people who would have known those who had died were all based in Leitrim or in West Cavan, where the Leitrim Observer is sold hand in hand with the Anglo-Celt. You wouldn't see the Leitrim Observer, maybe Ballyconnell, maybe, and then after that you don't generally see it so much. So they know their audience, and they know what paper is worth putting these notices in. Now, barriers, either natural or man-made, can obviously lead to isolation. And the example of Glan is not an isolated occurrence in Cavan. Borders of all kinds can lead to that same isolation, or the cutting off of different communities. The blowing up in 1973 of Ahalane Bridge, which linked Belturbet with the north, with Derry Lynn and down that direction, that cut off people on the northern side from their southern neighbours, and vice versa. And there's much anecdotal evidence which was recorded in a recent oral history project which Tom spearheaded here in the library, called Voices of the Troubles, I think it was, something like that, Voices of the Troubles. And a lot of people who were from the northern side of Ahalane Bridge would talk about how Belturbet had been their shopping town, their social town, where they'd go out on the weekend. Once the bridge is blown up, it would take you miles and miles and miles to go around. So that's it. No more Belturbet. It's all now Derry Lynn and Timor and that sort of area then instead. And so barriers, either natural, like the Quilca Mountains in West Cavan, or the destruction of a bridge outside Belturbet, they can lead to the same outcome, this cutting off of communities. And in some ways, the most western part of Tully Haw became an almost island state, cut off from the rest of Cavan, yet also separated by county divides and national borders as well, from its closest and in many ways truest neighbours, Leitrim and Fermanagh. The Fermanagh link was probably not as strong following partition, but if you're in Blacklion, walk across the road or walk across the bridge and you're in Belcoo in Fermanagh. So, there's that issue. But in earlier years, as we've seen with the case of the workhouse and the poor law unions, there had been a closer link with towns like Enniskillen and so on. And many of the people in Glan wouldn't have that kind of social link with the rest of the county that they would have with other areas. And there's plenty of anecdotal evidence as well of the people of West Cavan requiring directions to Breffni Park, which is 100 years, George is after writing a book about it, which is 100 years old just the other day, I think it was the anniversary, or going to the courthouse here to pay motor tax. That they got as far as Cavan, but they didn't know where the courthouse was, that they had to pay their motor tax. Online is a blessing now to us all. And in fact, I was looking through Anglo-Celt news items with Glangevlin for something else I'm doing, and I found a news item from the Anglo-Celt, the Glan News, the way you have the Belturbet News and Ballinan News and so on. And so there was a notice in 1946 about a match. It doesn't say what, I assume it was a county match, it doesn't say, but a match that was being played in Breffni Park, which was attended by many people from Glan who had never been to Cavan Town before, or who had never visited Breffni, which had been open for 23 years at that point. And this is the first time, that they'd come down to visit Cavan Town. Getting a bit crackly, that. But again, in fairness, why would you? Why would you bother putting yourself through the hardship? I often say that to myself when I'm coming home at 3 in the morning. Oh, Jesus. Will I ever get home? And so why would you? So it's tricky now with a car. You can imagine 100 years ago, people going on bicycles, and as your man said in the 1830s, you never put a railroad through it. And there's never truer word spoken. You could get everything you wanted locally. So why would you? And nowadays, as I say, the main shopping towns would be places like Carrick and Shannon, or I'll just move that, Carrick and Shannon, or Enniskillen, or Sligo, or some of those places instead. But it is also important to note that that's a two-way street. Many people from the rest of Cavan have no idea of Glan, Blacklion, Curla, Bomboy, Dowra, Swan and Bar, and so on. And in fact, display an amazing lack of knowledge of that area. I mean, people who say to me, oh, you're living in Glan or Dowra or Curla, or that's a very, very wide area. That's like saying to someone from Milltown they're from Belturbet, or vice versa. Or so, people sort of, all that area up there, We're not quite sure what it is, but it's up there, and it's all the one, but it's really not, And and you could probably give a talk like this as well, in fairness, about King's Court, which is in the Diocese of Meath, about maybe Virginia, which is kind of probably facing more towards Meath or Dublin, Ballygym stuff, which is sort of more closer maybe to Oldcastle, maybe in some ways. So so you could give this talk, as I say, about a couple of different areas if you wanted. I just happened to do it about Glan because I know the area well. And when I speak about football a moment ago, it's very important to note that Glan is true blue. In that particular way, Jason McLaughlin from Black Lion has been playing for Cavan for many years. Queeveen McGovern from Glan, a young lad, he wasn't well lately, but he was playing county as well. And that takes an awful amount of commitment to be driving up and down to training in winter weather and so on and so forth. And I know lots of people might travel from Dublin and so on as well, but it's a straight road, it's a motorway, So it takes a lot of commitment to do things like that. Anthony Ford, before that, from Black Lion as well, who played for Cavan for years as well. So it does take an awful lot of commitment to do that, but that commitment is always there. And if Cavan are ever in a fine or anything like that, you will see the blue flags everywhere in that area. And personalities like Nevin Maguire, the chef in Black Lion, would I suggest have done a lot, I think, to kind of promote an awareness of West Cavan and the investment in the Burren. Like I remember, about 15, 16 years ago, I used to bring groups up to the Burren, and the gate might be locked when you got there, and there was no pathway to speak of or anything like that. Now there's a lovely interpretive centre, there's good pathways through and so on. So a lot of people would come up more to visit that area. There's going to be a lot of work done at the Shannon Pot as well. There's going to be some kind of interpretive centre put in there in the next couple of years as well. So that promises kind of further interest in and a further knowledge of and appreciation of that area from the rest of the county. And I just want to finish that by saying that for me, Glengevelin is the most beautiful part of County Cavan. And even if it is only part of County Cavan by historical accident, I am very glad indeed that this county can claim a connection with the kingdom which the people there have fashioned for themselves and which they call the Kingdom of Glan. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Brendan. I think the introduction didn't go half enough. Fantastic well of information in relation to West Cavan. Probably something that we're not all that familiar with. I know we have when I was in the library, working in the library, we still have a prison service in Loughlin House, and I would have to go down there occasionally, And it's 45 miles down and 45 miles back. That's 90 miles. But that's not 90 easy miles, as Brendan alluded to. It really it's a half day's work to go to West Cavan and back. Really half the day is gone. So thanks very much, Brendan. Andy, we are kind of tying up tight for time, but we'll just take one or two questions if anyone has any comments to make.
Hi, really interesting, thank you. I'm just curious, is this something special about County Cavan folk, that we have this kind of divide between West Cavan? And I understand the geographical shape of the county and the geography that you explained about West Cavan. It's difficult, but my dad would always say if you're in Cork and you go back to Dublin, if you're coming from somewhere like Banty or stuff, you're halfway, you're doubling your time either side. Other counties have sporadic shapes and seem to be more united and seem to not have this divide. And I'm thinking, is there something about this Cavan County folk? Apart from, I understand the history, of the connection.
Yeah, I just think it's a social thing that's been there literally for a millennia. That part, like as I say, and as Tom alluded to there, the difficulty of getting there, even to this day. You can imagine 1,000 years ago, you just wouldn't come out that way or come in because it was totally cut off. Very, very difficult to get through. So you would be facing places like Leitrim and Fermanagh, Sligo as well, places like that, and you just wouldn't look towards Cavan for your social or anything else, And I think that has continued on, as I say, because of that, the physical divide is still there, and you really have to want to go there, to get there. You know what I mean? Because it can be tricky, and like on a nice day you won't see anywhere nicer, but like on a wet day or a snowy day, You know, like I do remember coming through Glan one time in the snow and getting out at Down-a-Creeve, and I thought it was going to be like the Pope. I was going to get on the ground and kiss the ground and say, thank God I survived, because it can be tricky, you know. So so I do think that is I think that's the real reason for it. It's just the geographical, and like even things like I didn't mention, like the things like the accent, like when you think of a Cavan accent, come here, hi. That's not in Glan. It's more a wished. Like it's more a Western kind of an accent. Like you would hear it very strongly in Drumshambo or Manorhampton, Drumkeeran, Drumahare. That's our North Leitrim. The Glan accent is much more like that than what we would consider like a broad Cavan accent.
Thank you. Any further questions?
I suppose.
Okay, yeah, okay.
I'm just reminded of the story that is told about how loyal the McGoverns are to each other. That the McGovern man, who is a contractor or something, building the underground
in New York, Pat the Glan man,
and apparently if you were from Glan, you just automatically got
You had a job, yeah.
And apparently the Chinese in New York heard about this, and they are reputed to have gone up to the recruiting office and saying, "Me Glan
I can neither confirm nor deny it.
Just to decide on that, we were in New York one time, and we were outside the Plaza, and there was a queue of about 50 people to get in.
The Eloise room.
Yeah, for the Eloise room, we have a branch right for Eloise. So anyway, we got up and the concierge, the girl who was there, you know, and she said, "Can we get no, she can't get in. She says, "Where are you from?" "I'm from Ireland." "What part of Ireland?" "Cavan." "Cavan." "What part of Cavan?" "Swanner." Her mother was from Swanner.
Her mother was from Glan.
Glan, yeah.
And we got in.
We got in. Anyway, any one further question?
Irish, I think you.
Yeah, it's just the map showed then of the sweat houses, the sweat.
Yeah.
Is that the topography of the area?
Yeah, it's an area, like particularly around Swanton Bar, is well known for its spas and stuff like that. So people, I mean, there's letters. I know Lord Farnham, the man who's outside here, has a statue outside. He wrote letters from Swanton Bar saying he was taking the waters. So it's that kind of water, sulphurous sort of water. And I think that ties into that area there, a lot of limestone and things like that as well. So I think that ties into. So if you ever go up to the Burren area, you'll see loads of them around that sort of neck of the woods.
Okay, we're kind of moving on for time. So thanks very much, Brendan. Appreciate that. So now we're back to Paddy for round two, thinking about migration.
Thank you, Tom. It's always a tricky thing to do is to talk to people just before their lunch. But talking to somebody immediately after somebody like Brendan, it's a challenge. And that is a fantastic talk. I heard it a similar talk maybe 10 years ago, and it lodged in my head that photograph of the gentleman with the drifts beside them or behind them. So we're moving here very much from a kind of a micro study to a very, very wide canvas. I want to really take an opportunity to think and share some thoughts about migration. It's a very, very big topic, but I just wanted to kind of get us thinking a wee bit about the way that we think in the Mellon Centre about the phenomenon of migration. When myself and Brian Lampkin published the book back in 2008, the closest we got to theory, neither of us are great theoricians, but the closest we got was a little model called the SDO3 model, which is just a way to kind of explain the way that we think about migration from a very simple definition, which is simply moving home. Okay, that's a simple definition that we deploy when we are talking about migration, moving home. In any migration, irrespective of direction or distance, we identify 3 stages. Leaving an old world, crossing an intervening obstacle, could be a stream, could be an ocean, and arriving into a new world. So those are the 3 stages of migration. In terms of directions, you can have 3 directions. You can have movement into a particular space, immigration as we generally refer to it. You could have movement out of that space, emigration, as we generally refer to it, or movement within that space, internal migration, as we generally refer to it. Then thinking about the three outcomes of any given migration. If you think of a polarity, at one end, the migrant who has arrived into a new world can remain entirely segregated. Okay? They have really very little contact. Their consciousness is in the old world. They're not integrated into that new world. The other end of that spectrum is integration, where easy, rapid integration into the new world. They're at home in that space within a matter of months, say, is that. But the reality, when you actually look at the experience of most migrants, both historical and contemporary, is what we defined as modulation. If you think, and I'll use the painting a little bit later on to kind of put some bones on this, but if you think of the migrant who is looking straight ahead, thinking about the new world only, they're much more likely to integrate into that new world. If you have somebody who's leaving, but continually looking over the shoulder to the home place, the chances are an element of segregation rather than integration in that new space. So that's the simple model that we deployed in 2008. I would suggest to you that the anchor concept in migration studies is really the concept of home. Yes, home suggests a place of permanent residence, but it is much more than this. You can live in a building for years, if not decades, without it feeling like home. So it's in part about emotional intensity, which connects you to that specific place. Here we look at the Mellon homestead at the Ulster American Folk Park, where Thomas Mellon grew up and returned later in life to revisit. The hearth in the Mellon house, in my opinion, is the nucleus of the Ulster American Folk Park. The heart of the place, and most visitors, I think, sense the energy that comes from that hearth. But home can be more than just one place for us. Here I use my own migration story to illustrate. So there's birthplace in County Armagh, 22 Victoria Street, where I lived until I was 11. And then a traumatic migration to Belfast, as all 11-year-olds who get moved at a point in time, who wants to go to Belfast? This was the Troubles, all that. And then a second home in Derryvolgie Avenue, South Belfast, where my educative years, both at Methodist College Belfast and then Queen's, was largely based at 6 Derryvolgie Avenue. And funny enough, about 3 weeks ago, I was in Belfast and I was parking, and believe it or not, to go to Queen's, that's about half a mile from Queen's, but to get a parking space, you could be as far up as Derryvolgie Avenue. So I parked almost unconsciously directly outside number 6. And when you look at the building and stuff, and I realised, you get this amazing frisson. I was almost tempted to ring the doorbell and say, do you mind if I come in and have a nosy about, have a look at my old bedroom? But it's now a solicitor, so I decided not to. Didn't want to get prosecuted. And then finally, home today, where I brought up my 2 sons and live with my wife. The townland of Letfern, about 1 mile east of a small village, Seskinore in County Tyrone. So in all those ways, those are all spaces that I can, at one level or other, identify as home. And I'm sure if we took the next 5 hours and went through your stories, you'd be able to identify similar places of emotional intensity. All of us can reflect on our migration story. If we think about our geographical path through life, from birth to death, we might imagine that we carry a little GIS tracker implanted onto us at birth, and imagine the incredibly complex map or readout that would eventually appear at one's funeral. You know, you could put it on the wall at your wake. This is my whole, engagement with the planet Earth in terms of where I've moved. The trajectory we actually cut as we pass through on the planet Earth. So I want to quickly revisit the 3 stages of migration, and the first one I want to turn to is leaving. The painting you're looking at was painted by Elizabeth Lady Butler in 1880 and is entitled Listed for the Connaught Rangers. Basically, you have a recruiting party for the British Army in the west of Ireland, I think almost certainly in West Kerry, having recruited the 2 young recruits. The essence of the emotions and perspectives of departure are encapsulated in the contrasting reactions of those 2 recruits. One of them, as I said earlier, looks back over his right shoulder to the village he has just left, perhaps imagining his return in the future. The other, in contrast, recruit looks straight forward, staring ahead, eyes focused only on the new world, his new world, rather than looking back to the village he's come from in the old world. The second stage of crossing between an old world and a new world takes us to twin decks on the replica ship, the Brig Union, in the Ulster American Folk Park. Migrants in the middle of the Atlantic ponder what we might call the tipping point, when you are actually closer to the new world of America than the old world of Ireland. This put in my mind a personal memory again. When we were kids, bound from Armagh to Newcastle, where we went for our summer holidays, we always awaited a particular point on the road about 3 miles short of Newcastle. And the 3 sons in the back, mum and dad in the front, and we were all lurching forward, because when you went round that bend, you got a prize for the first person to shout, "I can see the sea." So it's those little points, those little rituals that mark our journeys, which are ultimately significant. Finally, arrival. Here illustrated by an artist, John James Barrelett, around 1800, in a scene entitled "Liberty Welcoming the Arrival of the Immigrants." Clearly rendered in a classical form, the immigrants arrive into the new American Republic. So there's a sort of parallel, I think, Barrelett's drawing between the ancient republics, if you like, and democracies of Greece and Rome with the new American Republic. Barrelett is a particularly interesting artist to have actually constructed this image. He was the son, somebody asked earlier about Huguenots, he's the son of a French Huguenot settled in Dublin, and in 1796 he himself emigrates to Philadelphia. So this is just 4 years later. And again, I think some interesting features of the depiction. The children, the future generation, lead the way as the immigrants unload the tools and products of the linen trade, which signal their skills and positive economic contribution to that new American Republic. The image, in fact, is somewhat unusual, as it represents all 3 elements of the experience: the old world in the background, the ship crossing the water, and then the arrival into the new world. Migrants always harbour the possibility of return to the old world. In Ireland, historically, such remigration was comparatively rare. Return Yanks generally remained thin on the ground. Most, like Erskine Nichols' subject here, painted in the early 1850s, weighed up the prospect of return to Ireland, but ultimately rejected that proposition. Materially, Nichols suggests they had done well in the New World, but maybe, I think he hints, at the expense of others. Again, the Negro African-American figure in the background and the cotton bales, hinting, one might argue, at that particular scenario. Now, it's interesting to reflect back to the early 1990s and the early days of the internet. Yes, can we remember the early days of the internet? Years of trauma for some. 30 years ago, if you Googled migration, you were more likely to be directed to sites which related you to the migration of birds, fish, or animals. But today, the global refugee crisis has altered this. Language from the natural sciences still influences the discourse about human migration, but the metaphors often mislead rather than enlighten. I still remember selecting a book from a catalogue back in the late 90s called Atlantic Migration, The Answer, which we paid £37 for. It was a book about salmon, and the librarian in the folk park never lets me forget about it. Historical inquiry into migration patterns, particularly in Ireland, has tended to privilege transcontinental migrations, but ultimately the distance separating origin and destination is not crucial. The same deep structure of leaving, crossing, arriving applies irrespective of distance. Psychologically, physical distance is not decisive. A migrant who leaves Moygashel, a predominantly Protestant Unionist village in Tyrone, and travels a mere 2 miles to Moy, a predominantly nationalist village in Tyrone, may encounter as many obstacles to integration as someone who travels to the South Island of New Zealand. I'll leave you to ponder that. Since Mary Robinson made her keynote address in, I think, 1995 as Irish President about the importance of cherishing the Irish diaspora, there has been increasing attention to the concept of diaspora, the 80 million odd community across the globe connected to Ireland through historic migration. But diaspora as such at the national and intercontinental level remains a very abstract construct. In the 90s, Brian Lampkin and myself coined the idea of local diasporas and townland diasporas, recognising that every local place, including Glengevelin, enjoys its own more intimate and real diasporas which could play a part in local development today. And this is quite an interesting phenomenon. I was given a talk relatively recently in Saintfield in County Down, and in Saintfield they're building what they're calling a heritage park. And I suppose in some ways, looking back to an older model, they are using the money that provided by an American citizen whose great-great-great-grandfather left Saintfield. Now that's a very tangible, real form of physical development, but with the internet and all that comes with it, there's so much actually that your local diaspora today can contribute. And this is, of course, particularly germane in a divided society like Northern Ireland in terms of moving forward. This is on the right-hand side of the screen. It's just a glimpse rather, of a part of the Oma diaspora from the advertisements which appeared in the Boston Pilot. In reality, numerous local studies in Ireland forget their diasporas, and I think again that is a point that one really would want to try and force home. The importance that local communities can, and so much that they can gain from engaging with their diaspora. In 2005, Mary Sullivan submitted her dissertation for our Queen's University Belfast MSSC and focused on the notion of the Cavan diaspora. Thomas Kittle in the title was a representative symbol migrant born in Cavan but buried in Idaho in 1877. Mary selected a sample of, I think, 300 genealogical research files from, I think, over 10,000 that are in the archives of the Genealogy Office. I don't want to make her blush outrageously, but the external examiner was wowed and awarded the thesis deservedly a mark of 92%, the highest by any individual student in the entire duration of a 16-year course. And I think in many ways what we're doing this week is an outworking of that concept from 2005, and it has still, I think, much mileage to enjoy. We talked a lot about boundaries, and I was quite interested to hear some of the discussion about boundaries, because they are crucial. Migration involves the process of crossing boundaries. It might be a notion, but it could equally be a bridge over a small stream. Seamus Heaney has recorded his negotiation of a stream which marked out his daily walk to school between Castle Dawson and Balachi in South Derry. This image is of a small bridge on the road south of Falcarra in the shadow of Muckish, leading on over the hill towards the Lagan of East Donegal and ultimately into the port of Derry, where parties of friends, neighbours and family would part with emigrants from Bithor in West Donegal as they made their journey on foot to Derry and then perhaps Moville and emigration across the ocean. Emigration almost always into an English-speaking world. And if you look at the 19th century, more than 99% of the migrants who are leaving Ireland are destined for an English-speaking world. So in a way, the Bridge of Tears, I think, is a kind of cultural boundary between an Irish-speaking home in West Donegal and a largely English-speaking away in Britain, America and the lands beyond in the British Empire. Now, last week we had a group from East Tennessee State University who were with us for the week, and William joined us for an interesting exploration in Donegal. But on one of the days we arrived at this site to show them this site, and Jane McMurran, might have come from the Glan, their professor, who's a very gifted fiddler, took out her fiddle and embarked on a lament. And it really was one of the most poignant occasions that I've experienced. It really was one of those occasions when the hair stood up on the back of your neck, when you thought about the partings at this particular space. The Mellon Centre for Migration Studies at the Ulster American Folk Park has, since its foundation in 1998, been involved in family, community and migration history. The age of the internet has seen a very significant expansion in the popularity of genealogy. And COVID has also spurred, I think, an increasing interest in local studies as people reconnected with their own immediate environment, particularly in rural environments. So in a way, that's what I think we are involved in most of the time. We're involved very much with community engagement around the theme of migration. And again, around that, I'll bang it home one more time, the understanding of our own lives as migrants. Transcontinental immigration from Ireland in the era of mass migration after 1830 was regularly propelled by what the geographers refer to as chain migration. Intimate bonds or chains of connection shape migration from a particular locale in the diaspora with a particular home place in Ireland, as one immigrant followed on after another. An example can be identified on the island of Arranmore off the west coast of Donegal. Here, in the 3 generations after the Great Famine, a majority of departing immigrants made their way to Beaver Island in Lake Michigan in the Great Lakes, often being assisted to do so by prepaid tickets by a pioneer migrant who was already established in Beaver Island. Earlier this year, we hosted a group of second-year undergraduates from Queen's who were studying ageing, and we concentrated on the subject of age and migration. Human migration across time and space has almost always been dominated by young adults, roughly the cohort 16 to 25. Older migrants are certainly recorded. Thomas Mellon's grandfather Archibald was 60 when he departed for America in 1816. But older migrants generally struggled with adjustment to the new society. As parents inevitably aged at home, pressure could come on the young female immigrants in particular to return to Ireland to oversee care for them. Often this could lead to resentment and strained relations between siblings. It was also the case that children in America could be sent home to be cared for by extended family in rural Ireland, particularly in the rural West. It's striking to me how much of what has been written about immigration in 19th to 20th century Ireland pays limited attention to the variable of social class. But in parishes where land quality was mixed, small farmers and larger farmers, particularly the sons, migrated to quite separate destinations. The very poorest in rural society before, during and after the Great Famine often found it hard to cross the Atlantic without assistance, and temporary migration across Ireland and across the Irish Sea was often a viable alternative. I'm very fond of Jack Yeats' painting of the publican, which he painted in 1913 for a book by George Birmingham called Irishman All. It captures something of the Gombeen man, eager to sell a one-way passenger ticket to the landless labourer, and certain not to extend any credit in the spirit of grocery. Again, I think it's just one of those wonderful paintings that captures the spirit of a man to the core. The famine accelerated a transition in inheritance patterns already underway in Ireland. With increasing rapidity in the post-famine decades, farms were passed from father to son, normally the eldest, but not always, rather than farms being broken up to try and provide for all male heirs. As primogeniture took hold, younger sons looked to alternative means of making a living, and more often than not, these jobs lay outside Ireland. In some of the congested districts of the far west, older practices were sustained, and seasonal agricultural migration to England and Scotland persisted as an alternative to transatlantic migration. MCMS's strapline is exploring the migrant in everyone, trying to challenge the inclination to other the migrant. We might see in our television sets seeking refuge from conflict or the impacts of climate change in the modern world. Focusing on our own migration experiences and remembering those of our ancestors should help us to empathise with newcomers to our own society today. Sometimes migration occurs without any physical movement at all. Let us consider someone who lived in the South Armagh village of Crossmaglen a century ago. On the 2nd of May 1921, they lived in Crossmaglen, County Armagh, Ireland. On the 3rd of May 1921, it was Crossmaglen, County Armagh, Northern Ireland. The occupant had not moved, but their status and identity had been altered significantly. Nor was this uniquely Irish phenomenon. If we think about 20th century Europe and the two major conflagrations, it had a very important impact actually across the century. Of the core questions regularly posed by social scientists, geographers and historians, the one that is often ignored is the practical question of how any given migration is actually accomplished. The evolution of transport technology and systems could be transformative. The transition from sail to steam on the Atlantic route, which occurred remarkably rapidly in the early 1860s, revolutionised the emigrant experience, whilst integration with rail services made mass movements of people so much easier and ultimately affordable. Migration routeways in the age of sail so often evolved out of mercantile trade. As early as the 1720s, migrants from Ireland's northwest were sailing to Philadelphia from Derry on inward-bound vessels bringing flaxseed east across the Atlantic, and the owners of those vessels were very keen to have cash on the return journey and took a human cargo. Comprehending the experience of historic emigrants is greatly assisted by having recourse to thousands of contemporary emigrant letters, and we must be very thankful to the archivists, particularly in the 1960s, who in Prony really set about a campaign to bring in the material, emigrant letters in particular. So Prony today, thinking globally, has undoubtedly one of the greatest collections of emigrant correspondence anywhere on the planet. David Fitzpatrick's, who we've sadly lost in the last few years, his book Oceans of Consolation will remain one of the seminal works on Irish emigration. Sophisticated analysis and expert contextualisation brought to bear upon 14 sets of correspondence between Australia and Ireland. Equally, memoirs by those like Mickey McGowan and Thomas Mellon help us to understand the powerful emotional drivers at play and the can't read my own writing. Oh yes, and the importance of the desire to return to the Irish home, either on a temporary basis or more permanently. Thinking about testimony forces us to consider the communications technology and how today electronic texts, calls and emails can be more ephemeral than emigrant letters. So it poses a really interesting question about how Ireland's early 21st century experience of migration will ultimately be archived and then remembered. As somebody said tellingly in the Irish Times a couple of years ago in a column, you can't hug Zoom. I think after the pandemic we all get that. The grand narratives of history often serve distinct political purposes. Distortion, unfortunately, is a characteristic of the popular narrative moulded in Ireland and America. The simple idea of a neat segregated binary, Scotch-Irish 18th century frontiersmen, relentlessly contrasted with Catholic Irish-American populations in the post-famine cities. This, unfortunately, is just wrong. There's no other word that would do. Ulster Scots crossed the Atlantic in the greatest numbers in the late 1840s. And it's not even close. It's not a close thing. It's not an ambiguous thing. It's very, very clear cut. The Ulster Scots diaspora was forged between 1840 and 1910, just as it was in terms of Ireland as a whole. And I would argue that actually one of the things that Ulster Protestants and Catholics did genuinely together was leave. It deserves a laugh, that one. Getting towards the end. As we have already noted, by no means all migration was permanent. As Irish population accelerated in the later 18th century, increasing numbers of seasonal agricultural migrants, spalpeens in Irish, moved within Ireland to core arable grasslands, and then increasingly across the Irish Sea to farms in both Scotland and England. In West Donegal, Gweedore, they talked of those who were working forby. Now, nobody outside Gweedore would know what they're talking about, but everybody in Gweedore knows the coded language of forby, meaning they're on the other island. As time passed, increasing numbers of temporary migrants took advantage of a broader range of employment, particularly in the towns and cities of Britain. In the 20th century, large numbers of men, particularly from the west of Ireland, worked at construction and navying in Britain. Jack Foley, a former student on our MSSC, produced a dissertation which later became a book, focused on migrants from his hometown of Swinford in East Mayo. And we are currently a partner with Donegal County Council in a very interesting project looking at the working lives of migrants from that county in Scotland over the last 3 generations. I didn't actually write anything on a card here, but I suppose 2 things that would come to my mind. One of them is an incredibly powerful speech that your president made in Milford and Donegal at the annual commemoration of the famine. And it's available online, and I would commend it to anybody as a really top-notch summation of what we know in 2023 about the events of the Great Famine. And I think if I've learned anything over the course of the 16 years we taught the Masters, it is the centrality of trauma and the memory of leaving and parting, and the trauma that can leave in an individual migrant's life. But if you then read that into the wider sociological picture of Ireland, I think we take due account of the importance of that. And to come back then finally to the illustration which Liam showed of the priest's blessing in 1852 at the tail end of the famine, and the emotion, the crying that he referred to in that image, parting was almost always something that went very deep. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paddy, for putting the whole question of human migration into context. He mentioned about the MSSC course. Mary did it, I did it, Jack Foley did it, so you can imagine how enjoyable the lectures were for the 2 years we did it. Anyway,
you're very good.
We have time for some questions.
Just a quick one. You mentioned ships going with flaxseed to here, and I didn't catch the time.
From the 1720s. So the importation of flaxseed from the American colonies to Derry, and basically creating the tween-deck space that was then available on the return leg to take immigrants. So in a way, you know, when you ask the question, well, why did immigrants decide to leave Ireland? One of the questions is because they could. The answer is because they could, because the logistics of mercantile trade creates the tween-deck space, which allows for the profit. I mean, what captain or ship owner wants to send a vessel back to Connecticut empty. Apart from it being less safe because of ballast and so forth, it's actually not profitable. And trust me, as my old friend, I always get this quote in, don't I, William? Old friend Bill Crawford always said, he's 18th century, he was from Coleraine. He says, one of the things these people in the Presbyterians in the 18th century, he says, one thing that they understood here, money. He wasn't far wrong.
Okay. Can I make an observation?
Sure.
It's not a criticism in any way, okay? But I've lived as a migrant for almost 40-something years in Canada.
Yeah.
My family, first of all, immigrated to England, where I finished my education from age 15. I came back to Ireland in the 70s, lived here, and in the late 70s we decided we couldn't bring up children in the Ireland of that time. And we migrated to Western Canada, to Vancouver, where I found myself with maybe 20 other Irish people in the city of Vancouver at that time. That's very different now. There's hundreds of them, thousands of them. Our life has engaged with many migrants from different countries, from the Philippines, from all over Africa.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I doubt there's one migrant in all of those people who lived in Canada who would say that they wouldn't go back if they could. And it's usually economic migration of one sort or another, legal and illegal, as they call it. But Ireland does very little to encourage its migrants to come back.
Yeah.
The government has policy.
Yeah.
The Irish Times has overseas newsletters and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But it's damn hard to get back.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting observation, and thank you so much for sharing it with us, because when people tell their own migration stories, it really helps to think about the patterns. One thing, first of all, I think one of the most traumatic things, when we talk about trauma like that, we think in terms of the traumatic memory go back to the 1840s. But actually the experience of lots of people in Ireland over the last 50 years or more even has been particularly traumatic because there's a sense of rootlessness. And what I mean by that is the economic highs and lows. You go through the 70s, in the early 70s things were grand. There was actually net immigration for a brief period into Ireland. Then you get the 80s, collapse. People have to go. Then they come back in the early 90s, and then people have to go again after the crash 2008. So it's this lack of security. I don't know how likely it will be that I'll definitely be living in Ireland in 5 years' time, because I don't know what the economic pattern is going to be. I can't say with complete security. So this builds in a kind of insecurity, and I think that's particularly traumatic for people, even if they don't go and they remain in Ireland. The sense of insecurity is a difficult one. There was something I was going to say and I've forgotten now, but no, thank you very much for sharing the story.
Just add one thing to what I said, and the particular problem that most migrants have is to bring up their children who are living in Canada, for example, to bring them up with a sense of Irishness, because the kids are growing up in the foreign country.
Yeah.
They may have Irish names. There's a Finbar and a Killian and a Donald in my family.
Yeah.
But they're Canadian.
Yeah.
And they're world citizens now. They don't see themselves, that first generation of kids, as Irish.
No.
The American disagrees.
Okay. Oh, excellent, I've started a row. No, but the thing again is just to say, I get that, but is also for us, this is the thing about, having empathy, is that for us in Ireland, to remember that and think about that for somebody from Poland or Malawi or wherever they are around the world who comes to Ireland, that the issue of ethnic identity, what can the host society do best to encompass a balance in terms of that, what I call modulation, that people will always, as migrants, not always, but most of the time, look back to their old world and seek to settle into the new world, if they've got space that allows them to do that.
Children get assimilated.
Yeah, inevitably. And that's human nature. you want them to grow up with a sense of identity of the place you have come from, and that's perfectly natural and normal and good. But you also have to allow them space to integrate into who you were and take on. I mean, I like your thing of global. The most important thing in the 21st century, to be brutally frank, is that we have got 8 billion global citizens, because if we don't... Yeah?
Speaking about migration and encouraging people to come back, I have a niece who came back, married an Irishman, is raising children in Portadown right now. And as a family, we thoroughly enjoy and love that she has done that. Because my whole childhood, we heard nothing but our Irish ancestors, a whole slew of them. And that they came, in 1820, came from Ireland into down St. Lawrence River to Rochester, New York. And we heard that over and over again. And the different the family branches of Irish. And now we have one of ours migrating back to Ireland and starting a family here, and we love it.
Good, great. What can I say? Yeah.
We have a tendency, in the United States, we often refer to ourselves as Irish American.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it's never left us. And my father's family, my grandparents came from Lithuania. I am not a Lithuanian American as much as I am an Irish American. And I think part of it is that we tend to go with whatever our mother's culture was, because it's our mother's mother who's coming in all the time and whatever, as opposed to, but my cousins who lived near my grandparents are far more into Lithuanian stuff. And of course I had a grandmother whose birthday was St. Patrick's Day, so I mean, there's no hope. But we really do, and especially coming from the Boston area, we are Irish Americans, and that's what we consider ourselves to be.
Yeah, interesting. There was a book a guy, anthropologist at Queen's wrote maybe 20 years ago, Reg Barron, called Irish Americans. And he was basically looking at the factors that, condition why in upstate New York, he was doing a case study there, people adopted this. And of course the thing is that through time, different ethnicities in America have, I hate to use the word, but elements of varying degrees of sexiness, at particular junctures. So at one point in time, somebody wants to be Irish American, or they want to be Italian, or they want to be Lithuanian, whatever it happens to be that they want to stress at that particular moment in time. We've come through a period in the last maybe 15 years, I think, where Irish American has had a revival, and that more people actually want to stress Irishness within their lineage when they have a menu that they can select from often. So that's an interesting way to kind of think of it. What you say about the mothers is really interesting, because over the years, I think women actually get the job more often, not always obviously, but often within a family it's the mother or grandmother who is the inheritor of the stories and the lore related to. I'm getting quite a lot of female heads nodding anyway. So there may be something, a gender dynamic at work actually in terms of selection of ethnic. If you hear stories about your Irish lineage and your father sitting like the boy in the painting, smoking his pipe, saying nothing, then you're not going to attach to your Lithuanian heritage with the same enthusiasm.
They don't talk about it.
No.
That's the other thing. I mean, my grandparents came over early 1900s from Lithuania. It was never discussed. Lithuanian was spoken at home. My parents, my father, and all my aunts and uncles spoke it. Not one of the grandchildren was ever taught anything at all about Lithuanian or the language.
Yeah. I remember a woman, it's funny what you remember, but there was a woman about 10 plus years ago who came into the Mellon Centre for Migration Studies, and she'd been quite elderly, she'd been in 80 thereabouts, and she'd lived in an apartment in New York, and she remembered her own mother, and she said, my mother spoke Irish, but only to the dog. make of that what you will.
Any other question?
Yeah.
There's women who wrote letters.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, no, that actually is really interesting. I had intended one time to set out on that, to actually look at, we've 3,500 digital letters there, and looking at, you know, the gender, amongst other things, if there's any information about their age, trying to get a profile of those. But on balance, yeah, I think you're probably, if I was guessing, I would say the majority of the correspondence, the letter writers particularly, would be female. I think there's something in that, yeah.
And I think also the reflection on the whole country, let it be Lithuania or Ireland, also would be on your experience or maybe your reason for leaving, you know.
Yeah.
She's just died, but my oldest first cousin said she always talked about her mother, who was my aunt, who left in 1926, and she always said she never spoke about Ireland, she never wanted to come back, and there must have been a reason, she must have had a hard time. Yeah. But later, when I was doing a bit of the genealogy, I found out that she'd had a baby in 1925, and she left in 26, but her, who was effectively my oldest cousin, didn't actually know that. Her sister, their half-sister, never knew that this was the reason why.
Interesting. No, very interesting. Yeah.
But it influenced her entire outlook on the country afterwards.
Well, just as a comment on that is, again, thank you for sharing your story, is that actually one of the characteristics of Ireland was the very high levels of female migration. They're actually the majority of immigrants by the 1890s, so that's kind of important. But that many of them, and you can see this in very many of the letters, you know, that what they were leaving was a grim world, and they were delighted to get out. And that's why, in a sense, whenever you see cases where, as I hinted at, you know, there's a pressure comes on as the parents move from their 70s, you know, into their 80s, that, you know, we need you back here. And there's one particular case in my mind from West Cork where the young woman in her mid-20s has come back 2 years after she'd emigrated and to be main carer for the parents, and you know, she is not one bit happy about that situation because she's given up independence that she could never have enjoyed in rural West Cork, and she knows the world she's going back to. It is hard graft on a small farm in West Cork, never mind looking after your aged parents. So, you know.
On the question of emigration, did any Irish really go into farming? You're talking, you know, like Prince Edward Island, for example.
Sure. Yeah, no, there were. I mean, you know, I think again the general stereotype, but one which would be backed up by empirical evidence, is that more of the post-famine migrants particularly settled in urban and industrial contexts, including Ulster Protestants. So, you know, that's very important. So the old idea of the Davy Crockett, you know, rural frontiersman, it doesn't, the stereotype does not bear scrutiny. If you look at the experience as recorded in the letters I've described, Ulster Protestants who went to much greater places like Toronto were very typical of life in a big urban city.
And was there also a kind of an idea of publishing letters and papers to encourage emigration in the 1830s?
Oh, yeah.
There's one in the Western Telegraph about Prince Edward Island, and he's a Nalan man, and he says this is no place for a long, weak family. It was all about the linen and what you get for a linen and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is again a really interesting thing, but sure, no, absolutely. But the letters are crammed full of reconnaissance. You know, what they're providing really practical information. Yeah. Well, also all kinds of, you know, circulars, the explosion of literature, and as well, I mean, even government, you know, you're creating in the 1830s, you know, an environment which is favourable to migration, although government was not always in a position to encourage and assist that. A lot of people think assisted migration played a really big part. It didn't actually. It's quite a small percentage, you know, 1 or 2% of all of the migrants went with direct assistance from government.
Thanks very much. Right. And if we conclude that, I think it's 1:05 now, and we will break for lunch and resume at 2:15. Thank you.
Thank you.
but I don't guess that's the first time I've done that.
Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. A place where history is in the hills, where many have made their home, where seeds of friendship can be sown and new love begins to grow. We welcome back those who've left, who sought fortunes far away, but who have kept Cavan in their soul and will settle in without delay. There's magic in the waterways and the woods where you once stood. The evening lights are always bright and the food is always good. And if you venture to foreign lands, you'll always know you're not alone. Now again, as it was before, you'll be welcomed back to your home. Cavan is calling to all from far and wide to return to the place that they call home and feel a sense of pride. Cavan is calling